Hello friends, this is Odds, Pinky Promise, and for the next couple hours we will be discussing each of the 34 killers in Dead by Daylight and placing them on a tier list based on their strength. I will be following a very simple criteria that you can pause the video and read up right now if you want to be on the same page. And this is a very exciting time to be doing a tier list because since the last time we did one, a lot has changed. We've had some killers receive minor reworks here and there. We've had new killers be introduced since, with the latest one being Chucky. And also just now we had a glimpse at the next update with the PTB where another 3 killers got pretty significant reworks. So we will be focusing and talking about these killers that I just mentioned a little bit more, but don't worry, we'll talk about all of them. So if you watch this whole video, you should have a pretty good idea where I'm coming from. You can also use timestamps that are found in the description to skip to the parts that you're interested in. And if you're the kind of person that just wants to complain and disagree without watching the video, I respect that. Here's the full list. Feel free to go down in the comments and do that right now. But before we start with the 7.40 update tier list, we need to first talk about the PTB. In the PTB that is currently available right now, we have an early taste of these 3 killers being changed. We have Billy, we have Blight, and we have Sadako. And as you can see, some of them don't move at all, some of them move very dramatically. In my estimation, Blight stands still at his second spot. Yes, some of his very strong add-ons have been reworked, but what we have in the PTB is still very much a monster. I do expect that some of the add-ons in the PTB that are currently bugged will be fixed. I do expect that some of the more ridiculous add-ons that he got in the PTB that make him have infinite rushes and basically infinite turning rate, these things will probably be adjusted. But even if we account for these add-ons being a bit weaker, mind you, Blight is still very, very strong. At the high level especially, this killer is still miles away from the number 3 and number 4. I still think he's very, very strong. So he's a little bit worse than before, but not enough to knock him out of the second spot. Sometimes people argue that Blight could be better than Nurse in some situations, which might still be true, but I think that now Blight is the more obvious second spot. So not a lot to say here. Expect his PTB add-ons to be adjusted slightly, but he will still be number 2 easily. Now, Billy, on the other hand, makes a huge leap, climbing a lot of spots from the current place in the tier list. In the PTB, Billy is quite strong. There are a lot of subtle changes to his kit that are not extremely obvious as to why he jumps so much, but the most important ones that you need to understand, much of what made his add-ons good has been built into his base kit. He now has a much nicer speed to traverse the map, a slightly better cooldown, which makes a world of difference. There is a lot of times when the Hillbilly will end the chainsaw next to a survivor and will be able to get an M1, get a basic attack, even if the survivor was pretty close to a window or a pallet. This is something that he could simply not do before. And another playstyle that has become really obvious with the new Billy that you could not do before is bouncing around the map repeatedly. With the old Billy, if you use your chainsaw for mobility repeatedly, that actually puts you in a very vulnerable spot as your chainsaw would overheat and not really let you use it in chase right afterwards. This is the opposite now. This has literally been reversed. Hillbilly becomes arguably stronger by using his chainsaw repeatedly. So when watching really good players duke it out, it becomes really, really obvious that Billy now is an absolute monster when it comes to pressuring one survivor, but then immediately going back to a different area or switching back to another survivor that's in a worse spot or coming back to a hook or a generator or anything like that. So he's very, very good at pressuring hooks from medium distance. And even though he's very, very difficult to play and get the most value off, I do think he climbs very, very significantly. I also don't expect to be any extremely major changes from the PTB to live. I do think he's in a decent spot. So I'm pretty confident that by the time the release comes out, he will be somewhere around here. Now, some things to mention. He still has the same weaknesses that he did before. Indoor maps with lots of buildings and structures where he cannot easily pressure survivors and bounce back between one and the other are still his Achilles heel. And this is not going to change too dramatically. If you struggle a lot with Billy before, you're not suddenly going to be kicking ass with him. He will still be a very difficult and mechanically demanding killer. But that being said, his add-ons are more streamlined. Some of them are completely useless, but you don't have to use them. So just use the few that are really, really strong. And he's got a couple that are pretty scary. The add-on to make him 110 is actually a contender for a really good add-on. The Iridescent Engraving is a pretty strong add-on as well. There will be presumably more and more tricks that we'll see show up when people start to master his overdrive and how to use the chainsaw when it glows blue. So yeah, Billy is looking pretty good. Not too bad. Now, Sadako, on the other hand, has taken a massive dip. Sadako originally was in this very awkward state where the developers told us that she was very good in the statistics, but she was very, very weak. She used to be number 2, number 3, number 4 at the bottom of the list in my previous tier list. But then they buffed her, and she was insane. Very, very insane. But in this PTB, she's dropped back immediately again. She no longer has the ability to condemn map wide, which was an enormous source of power. We'll be talking more about that in detail later. So in this current PTB, survivors will 100% go and pick up tapes. There's no downside for picking a tape if you don't get hooked. And even if you do get hooked, it's not that big of a deal. So for the most part, Sadako now relies more on her basic stealth mechanics, which have been improved a little bit, but not too much, and her demanifestation mind games, which have been improved a little bit, but not a lot. So yeah, she goes back to being a much more average killer that excels in a few maps, that can be played to a decently high level, but that ultimately doesn't have a really powerful condemn. She doesn't have any add-ons, I think, anymore that are extremely, extremely mean. And there's generally no way for her to cheese the game and inflict condemn without potentially having to hook, which she didn't even have to do before. So for that reason, she's not the worst or anything like that, but she does drop very, very significantly in my view. I also think that this Sadako is probably perfect in the developer's eyes. I think this is very close to the original Sadako in terms of strength for the average player, even though she's much weaker than the one we have in the game right now. So I do expect the developers will probably appreciate the stats and like the statistics and not think that she's too powerful in this current state. So I'm pretty sure she's not going to get much of a buff, if any at all, by the time the patch comes out. So my estimation is that Sadako drops pretty dramatically. But if you want to know how strong the current Sadako is, don't worry. We're now going to go away from the PTB and back to the real game that we have right now and talk about each killers, starting, of course, with the Queen of Dead by Daylight, the Nurse. So the Nurse has been the strongest killer in the game for a long time, and by the looks of it, it looks like she will continue to be number 1 for a very long time. There is a very high consensus among the community that this is the case. You probably agree already, so I don't need to convince you very much of it. But we're still going to talk about some of the things that really keep her in this number 1 spot. The most important one is just her power. With her power, the Nurse avoids having to deal with windows, pallets, and other common elements of chase that most other killers have to at least play around most of the time. She instead is able to teleport through obstacles and hit survivors anywhere. If a Nurse plays perfectly, which is not that hard sometimes with some perks and good luck, she is definitely always having an upper hand on survivors. Survivors cannot use strong maps or lots of resources to delay her. All they can really do is run behind line of sight breakers, get behind walls and obstacles, try to make the visibility worse for her somehow so that she has a harder time using her power. That's everything they can do other than maybe outspace her and try to draw her away from the objectives. It's very difficult, however. The game is definitely tilted towards her, even at her worst, in her worst maps. As you can see, she is always near the top. She is extremely consistent. And the funny part is that the Nurse has actually been nerfed over the years many times. Some of the more recent nerfs in recent months include the fact that, for example, her add-ons got nerfed. Some of the really strong add-ons she had are now weaker, and it doesn't matter because her new add-ons are still really good. She now has an add-on to apply Mangled, an add-on to increase her range, an add-on to increase her lunge. These 3 would already be enough to make her still very, very competitive. She also used to apply basic attack perks with her teleport attack, with her blink attack. So she could use Starstruck or Know It or other insta-down perks. She cannot use those perks anymore, which is a nerf. but she's also gained a new flux of information perks that are arguably even stronger. Insta-down Nurse was scary, but Information Nurse is scarier. Nowhere to Hide, very, very strong perk that makes chasing around generators and some maps almost impossible. Ultimate Weapon allows her to basically cover her only weakness, which is the ability to find survivors. That is generally one of the only things Nurse is somewhat naturally bad at, and with one perk, you completely solve it. You find survivors anywhere. All of these things really keep Nurse very, very solid in the #1 spot. Some time ago, you could have argued that Blight could sometimes overtake her and I think that's completely reasonable, but especially seeing the changes that will come to Blight in the future, if she's not #1 now, she will be #1 very, very soon. And that's all you need to know about the Nurse. Moving on, however, we have the Blight. The Blight in the PTB will definitely go down a notch, but as he exists right now, he's extremely busted. He has an excellent power that is multiplied in a very cruel fashion by his incredibly strong add-ons. Easily, right now, the strongest set of add-ons in the game until they get nerfed. So, he has a power that gives him mobility, that gives him the ability to break pallets and walls in the same motion as well. This power does have about a 10-second cooldown at worst, which is very little compared to other killers that we'll see later. It has a very short cooldown animation as well, so it's very easy to miss an attack and still be relatively on target. And even if you don't use your power at all, he has the natural 115 mobility, so he can be played like a normal killer in the few times when his power cannot be used or is on cooldown. On top of having excellent mobility that works well even in indoor maps, this power is also an excellent anti-loop skill tool by itself. You can use his power in incredibly diverse ways that make it very difficult for survivors to honestly last much anywhere. Even in some of the safest buildings and structures in the world, Blights have at least one or multiple ways to hit you. They can play the bump logic route, which means that they'll bump into different points around the loop and eventually use their speed to catch up to you. They can also use the hug tech route, which basically means that they hug certain areas and use the rush by, they flick around certain corners by hugging them, which is a technique that you initiate by rushing into an obstacle and gliding around it. So there's quite a bit of depth to this. It's definitely not a killer that is super easy to pick up, but once you understand the basics, and oh my god, once you become really, really good with the advanced stuff, he's ridiculous. And now we talk about the add-ons. He has probably more S-tier add-ons than anyone else in the game. He has add-ons to increase his speed, which are some of his best. These add-ons make everything else that I've talked about much worse. They make his ability to control the map more and more oppressive towards the survivors. It makes his anti-loop less and less possible to even avoid. Even really good survivors have often no choice. He obviously also benefits from having very strong gen control perks, with the ability to chase people and down them quickly, with the ability to go to generators and kick them quickly. Perks like Eruption, Pop, Painless are all incredibly easy to use on him. And he basically makes these perks, which are already some of the best perks in the game, even easier to use. And we haven't even talked about some of his high-level add-ons, which are getting gutted in the next patch. He has Alchemist Ring to hit a survivor and then immediately use power again, busted. He has an add-on to instantly break pallets and slow down survivors, again, busted. He even has an add-on to insta-down survivors, which on the hands of very good players is absolutely ridiculous and can always turn a game around. So yeah, do I even need to go on? Like, is it not obvious that this killer is not at least #2? He is so powerful. He is so absolutely ridiculous that in some situations, and especially around competitive level, he is arguably stronger than Nurse and puts out more pressure than Nurse, which is insane to think about. Now, the one reason perhaps why in this tier list he's not above Nurse is that he's a lot less forgiving. There are actually some things survivors can do to counter Blight, such as body blocking, blocking his landing spots, a few techs here and there to get him stuck or make him miss. That and Obviously, there's also the issue that you do need to have very deep map knowledge, react very appropriately, good reflexes, good thinking. This is sometimes easier said than done, and you need to play him to a very precise level. Whereas with Nurse, you have a lot more room to make mistakes and still get good results. So since he does get similar results for a bit more work, I think that would arguably be the deciding factor that makes him number 2 instead of number 1, in my view. But definitely, as of the next PTB, he will be number 2. Alright, so next up is the Spirit, and with her we arrive at the first killer that, while still being really, really powerful, she isn't borderline insane like the other two. If you look at her variability line, you'll see that at her best, she is close to Blight and Nurse, but at her worst, she can actually dip quite far below and be more in line with other killers that we'll talk about in a minute. And that's because ultimately she's just not that consistent, she's just not that insane. And as you'll see, her add-ons are a little bit more in line with other killers. She used to have, you might remember, some extremely powerful add-ons. Some of them got reworked, then some of the strongest one more recently got nerfed, and now her add-ons are still very powerful, but not as insane as before, not to the level of before, not nearly. But that doesn't matter too much, because her main thing, the thing that really makes her this powerful, is a natural ability of hers to disable the skill of the survivors that she plays against. She has this built-in effect that makes survivors that are good look mediocre, and survivors that are average look absolutely terrible. And it's because of a few things. The first one is her passive phasing. She has an ability that cannot be seen by her or controlled by her, but that happens passively. And from the survivor point of view, you will see her body flicker and disappear briefly. This sometimes makes survivors be temporarily unable to know exactly where she is. In a loop, when you switch sides, it might also conceal the exact moment at which you turn. And sometimes you will have survivors make mistakes and steal a place just because they don't know exactly where you are, completely passively. And then, forgive me, and then when you begin to use your power, things get even worse, because when you use your haunting, you become completely invisible. You don't see survivors, survivors don't see you. They might hear where you're coming from, but you also hear their voices, their grunts, their footsteps, any dust they kick up, or other animations around the map. You can perceive them. And in this situation, the survivors have to make a decision, and you have most of the control. If you catch them in the open, you hit them. If you have a certain add-on to detect their location with Killer Instinct, you hit them. If it's a pallet or a window that is not super safe, even if they make the right play initially, you might still use your power to go around and hit them while they're locked in animation. And as I said, even really good survivors are caught off guard all the time. This is a 50-50 that is heavily tilted. It's not really a 50-50. It's heavily tilted towards the survivor getting hit. Once a hit happens, the Spirit does go on a somewhat lengthy cooldown. During that time, she's 110 killer, and this is where her weakness really begins. Her only weakness really is the fact that on bigger maps, survivor splitting up might make things a little bit difficult. You don't have insane add-ons for crazy mobility or anything like that before. You still have something that Nurse and Blight don't have, which is the ability to hit with your basic attack. Unlike Blight and Nurse, when the Spirit uses her power, you hit with a basic attack. So she is really good at using insta-downs and perks that apply on basic attack like Sloppy Butcher, which is awesome. But ultimately, if you get a little bit unlucky, if a pallet drop comes at the right time, if you chase the wrong person for too long, maybe if the person that you chase has some unusual perks, such as Lucky Break that removes scratch marks, or Off the Record, or Iron Whale that might make them silent, that could make things a little bit difficult, and that will happen from time to time. But for the most part, as I said, her chase definitely leans towards her. It is tilted towards her. This placement definitely assumes that you are an absolute demon on Spirit, though. If you are not very accurate with her, I would easily drop her a few spots, and the next killer would probably take number 3. But assuming that you take the time to get a proper headset, listening carefully, and play her optimally, she probably retains the 3rd spot in the list. Which is to say a lot, because our next killer is fairly strong. And our next killer is the most recent addition to the list. Chucky, aka the good guy. The good guy is actually pretty insane. And the most noticeable feature of him compared to the other killers that we've seen so far is the absolutely insane ratio of difficulty to result. With the other killers that we talked about, we need a lot of mechanical skill, a lot of guessing, a lot of quick reactions, and all of these things. This killer is nothing like that. This killer is extremely easy to play. And he's good at every level. His low stature and stealth capabilities and the very unusual way in which he plays with third person, all of these things are really, really good for killer. And for beginner and intermediate survivors, they make things really hard for them. He also obviously excels in indoor maps. He's not bad in open maps. He's good almost anywhere. And once you get a little bit better and you reach a higher level and you go against better opponents, does he keep up? Unlike other stealth killers, yes, he does. And that's because he also has an insane chase power. His power allows him to, among other things, vault windows faster than usual. But underneath the pallet, you can scamper through it. And then he also has a dash that reaches quite far and ends with a hit. And this means that you're safe exactly nowhere. If his power is not on cooldown, you are not safe anywhere. You don't have any part of the map, even if there's a pallet up, even if there's a lot of resources, that is genuinely safe against him. Pallets on their own will be scampered underneath. Windows on their own are not typically strong enough. The only thing you can do is hope that he misses, hope that you have a really good combination of pallet and window and you can kind of chain them together, but it is very, very difficult. And his power, unlike other killers that we'll talk about today, is actually very, very forgiving on the killer. It is very easy to control. It is very easy to adjust last second. You don't need to commit terribly to one action or another. And the hitbox is extremely forgiving. I myself, when I play against killer, I can sometimes spin a killer. I can sometimes even spin a blight because their power kind of lends itself to that. But dodging an attack from this killer is incredibly difficult and happens very, very rarely. So, with all of that, what does it mean that this killer has this insane power? It means that every 15 or 20 seconds, whatever his cooldown is based on add-ons, you are probably going to get hit. And even competitive level survivors routinely get trashed by this killer. And that's your evidence that this killer is really, really difficult to avoid. On top of that, there's also the odd tech here and there. There are some tricks on this killer that are very obviously exploits that will probably get patched. But even if we assume that those are patched soon, the rest of tricks that you can do with this killer is pretty strong and fairly simple to do. He has the ability, they did nerf his initial ability to flick. On release, this killer had an ability to flick 180 around corners, which was really, really insane. And I think in that version of Chucky, he probably would have been number 3 in the tier list. They removed this ability to flick. He's now a little bit weaker in that regard, but he has a different trick that allows him to do something fairly similar. With certain inputs and moving your camera a certain way, you can still go around the wall and hit behind it in a U-turn kind of way. So that means that survivors find no safety anywhere. In a lot of normal loops, you can also use your third person to peek behind corners, which is something that only survivors typically can do. Not to mention that his field of view is obviously completely different from other killers, so any kind of trick or spin or anything that might work on another killer that is too close to you doesn't work so well on him. This killer is pretty insane. He's very consistent, and it mostly comes down to you hoping that he makes a mistake, because if every 20 seconds he's getting a hit, eventually you'll run out of health states, the slowdown perks are going to pile up on top of each other, and he will be very, very difficult to shake off. Moving on is what I assume might be a controversial placement. On spawn number 5, I place the Plague. Now, the Plague, as you can see, based on her variability, can actually drop quite a bit. At her worst, this killer is a tall, particularly not fast, 115 movement speed killer that has to hit normally. So if you play her at her worst, just infecting things every now and then, chasing people, hitting them, she is absolutely nothing remarkable. Now, what you need to consider, though, is Plague at her best. Plague at her best is really, really scary. On top of her natural ability to infect survivors and break them, which absolutely helps with the current state of medkits, which are a very common item. So on top of her natural ability to pretty much discard and minimize healing related perks and items, she has a lot of other things going on. She has a base kit red pool that gives her a power for at least 1 minute. This can be enhanced by multiple add-ons. During red power, she can down people very, very quickly. Some maps, you have absolutely no safety. Short loops are essentially a death wish, and you need to find structures to avoid her. She is incredibly good at camping and trading. When someone is unhooking in front of her, if she has her red puke, she can prevent it from any angle, which is a very unusual thing. Even Huntress, for example, cannot do that. So you can prevent unhooks or punish them very, very severely, even from a distance. And even if you don't have the ability to prevent that with Repu, you can still fully infect people through someone on the hook. Not to mention that people that are on the hook infect other people, that you can infect generators, and so on and so forth. You probably already know how Plague works, and that might still be a bit shocking to see her this high, but the real thing that elevates Plague, that makes her this high, is no doubt her top tier add-ons. Her top tier add-ons, I would say, are ridiculous. If you pair them with a certain build, this killer is nothing short of cruel. A sample of what the top tier add-ons can do. Let's say the worst possible example for this. If you bring the Iridescent Seal, and then pair it with the amulet that increases the duration, and then you bring a perk like Deadlock to make sure that gens cannot be done together quickly, then you have a killer that will have 1 fountain by default. So that's 1 minute of red power, and then 5 at worst, I'm assuming that they complete all generators, 5 more fountains for free. So that means that you will be dealing with a Plague that for at least 5 minutes, give and take, will have her power constantly. This is absolutely ridiculous. There's no way that if you're a good Plague and you bring a build like this, that you ever lose. Then you can add other things on top of this to make it even worse. We also have an Iridescent add-on that makes the auto survivors highlighted, and it doesn't tell them about it. We have other add-ons that have really insidious effects that are not super obvious. Even a meme add-on that actually makes gameplay quite different and difficult. And we haven't even talked about her mechanical skill and what she can do in certain loops as well. Really good Plagues learn how to puke backwards to change the momentum of the puke and make it drop down like an airstrike. Even a very average Plague can learn some tricks to make some loops actually really hard. And one thing that's really nice about the Plague is that if you play against a survivor that is very obviously experienced and very obviously amazing, you don't necessarily need to commit to them. You can puke on them and watch them become injured, and they'll either be useless and not be able to take a hit for anyone else, or cleanse and give you power eventually. So her ability also to ignore certain survivors and focus on the weaker links is something that other killers don't possess naturally. So yeah, mostly it comes down to her ability to ignore healing perks and the ability to be extremely powerful with some very strong add-ons. If it wasn't for that, Plague would definitely be a bit lower, because after all, she is a bit map dependent. With some maps, you will find your fountains in really awful spots. RNG plays a factor as well. Your 1 fountain could be in a bad spot, and if at that point you don't have good add-ons to get power elsewhere, that's gonna hurt. So yeah, that would otherwise bring her a little bit closer to other A tier, A minus killers. Yeah, she would probably drop a few spots if it wasn't for these very powerful add-ons. Next up is the Oni. Now, the Oni, I would also say, would go down a few spots if it wasn't for the particular state of the meta that we have now and will have for the foreseeable future. The Oni is a basic killer that starts with the basic stats: 32 meters, normal lunge, normal height, normal terror radius, yada yada. But the more he injures people, the more he picks up his power, and when he picks up his power, he has one of the scariest powers in the entire game. He is able to move very fast, insta-break stuff, insta-down people, and he can do this for about 45 seconds default. And with duration add-ons, which are his bread and butter, he can go for quite a bit longer. Every time you down someone, you lose a bit of power, but you can still manage to get a lot of downs chained together. Now, some time ago, the major problem with Oni, other than getting the first hit and getting the ball rolling, would be what happens after the initial down. If survivors are smart and they split up, you should find that it's difficult to get the first hit, and even if you get the first hit, you down a survivor, and if you pick them up, you lose your momentum. And if you leave them on the ground, maybe they have some anti-slugging perk that allows them to get back on their feet. So it is actually a little bit scary to commit to downing a person and then trying to go for someone else. Sometimes you might also find that you have your power, but you don't really know where survivors are. So you have to waste time going around the map at normal speed to find them and not using your superior speed, right? And not to mention that sometimes even if you do make a great play and you down 2 survivors, maybe the other 2 survivors are finishing the last gens. So you would need a lot of information. You would need to make a lot of risky decisions. But all of that has changed for the most part. Oni has access to one perk that is so unbelievably powerful on him, that is so, honestly, downright unfair, and that is Ultimate Weapon. With Ultimate Weapon, you have a 2-in-1 tool. Number 1, at the start of the game, you can open a locker to trigger Ultimate Weapon, and you will now find survivors that you walk around the map and that you come across with. This is huge because it allows you to pick a survivor that might be in a bad spot as your first chase. Before, as an Oni, unless you had Lethal Pursuer, which was a good idea, by the way, but if you didn't have Lethal Pursuer, you would probably only find 1 survivor or 2, and if you committed to them, you may or may not get your power at some point, and if you don't commit to them, well, maybe they'll call you out, maybe everybody else will hide, and who knows, maybe the next survivor that you find is in an even better spot. So it was a bit of a gamble. But with Ultimate Weapon, you have information at the start to pick the survivor that you want to chase, and later on throughout the match, you can use Ultimate Weapon to find people. So after you have a person on the hook, you can use your power, open a locker, go around the map, find people. You have a person on the ground and a person on the hook, open the locker, now find the other 2. With the mobility of Oni in his power and his naturally big terror radius of 32 meters, you going around the map at max speed allows you to cover the entire map. Survivors have no way of hiding in any way that is reasonable other than hide in a locker far away, have calm spirit, which is not something they are going to realistically do often. So for that reason, you have a tool to find survivors when it's most convenient to you and they have no way of hiding. And if at that point they're caught with their pants down a little bit, if they're caught off guard in a bad spot, they're going down as well. And yeah, that's just tough. Put on some good speed add-on or good orb increasing add-ons, put duration add-ons, bring Ultimate Weapon, and if on top of that you also bring slowdown, this killer is really, really, really strong. We didn't really mention this, but yeah, his chase is pretty strong. Once he has power, he has mobility, he has insta-down, and which we did mention, and he also has a few tricks up his sleeve that allow him to do flicks, run into things, and force 50-50s. He does have quite a few tricks up his sleeve that if you watch good Onis, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, one thing worth mentioning is that in the PTB, the Oni seemed bugged and his flick, his ability to use his power seemed different. I do expect this to be a bug. I hope this is a bug. So I'm not taking that into account for this tier list at all. And I'm hoping we will not see that. But yeah, mostly for the purposes of Ultimate Weapon, I would say this killer automatically gets bumped a little bit from where he would be otherwise. Next up is Wesker. Wesker is an amazing killer. He's very, very strong. Now, some people perhaps overestimate how strong he really is just because he's so common and he's so reliable and he's so powerful. But as you'll see with Wesker, he doesn't have any of the insane nuclear options that some of the other killers have. He is as strong as it gets while still being relatively fair and predictable. Unlike Blight, he doesn't have any insane add-ons that increases his recovery by 100% or increases his speed by 25%. All of his add-ons are, for the most part, very minor. And yeah, Wesker experts might have their pick and might have their preferences, but none of them really change the way he plays in too much of a dramatic way for survivors. So for the most part, he is a very stable killer. And how strong he is or is not will depend on the map, on how he performs, and how much survivors allow his power to fester. So this killer, honestly, cannot be broken down into one simple thing. Unlike other killers that just have one really good thing going on for them, this killer has a lot of small things. First of all, he has a big terror radius, which sometimes can help with certain builds. He has a little bit of dash mobility that allows him to close the gap. This isn't insane. This doesn't really allow him to cover the map crazily, but it does pose a threat, and it does allow him to close in the gap when necessary. This also means that survivors holding forward, which is a strategy that you do with like half the killers, do not really get a free pass. If a survivor goes forward in a straight line without looking back, this killer will catch up to them, sometimes much faster than they think. So he has got that going for him. When he grabs a survivor, he can sometimes injure them. If the survivor has been infected prior and didn't take care of that, he will be potentially insta-downed if they're smacked at full infection. And he can also sometimes set up easy follow-up hits. If you grab a survivor and toss them into a wall, sometimes, if that's the edge of the map, that will force the survivor to come back into you, and they won't make much distance at all. So he can sometimes get really nasty hits that lead into other hits. Other things that he can do. He can grab a survivor that's been recently unhooking someone and then smack them against the unhooker. That is a really cruel thing that is really powerful. It makes one person lose a health state and the unhooker go immediately into deep wound, which will deny things like borrowed time, off the record, and so on. This obviously ties in very well into his ability to tunnel. Because you have to get rid of the infection at some point, you will inevitably have to reveal your location. When you use the spray on yourself or someone else uses it on you, the killer will get a notification, and this just means that at some point you will need to show yourself. And if you get interrupted, or if the killer catches you shortly after, or if you never get to use the first aid spray in the first place, your infection will climb up again and you'll be hit by the slowdown as well. The slowdown happens when the infection is full, and it makes looping him basically impossible. Unless you have somewhere really safe, looping any killer with a -8 hinder status effect on you is brutal. You're just very slow. And on top of that, he also has the ability to vault pallets. Not always a huge deal, but it is sometimes really useful. You used to be able to go underneath him basically when he vaulted a pallet and outplay him, and this ability has been mostly removed. Apparently you can still pull it off sometimes, but if a Wesker vaults a pallet, you can't go and vault it back through him anymore, at least not easily, which is good. I also noticed that in the PTB, the developers explain that Wesker now will not be able to change the direction at which he throws a survivor, but then in the PTB it seems like he could. So I'm going to be assuming, of course, that this ability isn't going anywhere. If in the next patch they remove that ability, then Wesker could be a tiny bit worse. What I'm talking about is the Uro bending tech. Basically, when a Wesker grabs you, he can move his camera before the grab to toss you to the left or to the right, and this makes certain plays a little bit easier. So that ability is still in the game, and it's still in the game in the PTB, but the devs said they might remove it. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, all of these things together, the fact that he's fairly easy to play, the fact that he's fairly good on most maps, the fact that he's got a few techs that really high-level players can exploit as well. I say exploit like it's a bad thing. The fact that he has got a few tricks as well that can make him unpredictable do make him a fairly strong killer. But at the end of the day, he doesn't have anything too insane. So I do think this position is warranted. The hardest thing by far, the biggest asset by far, is just the fact that you force survivors to use a spray, which delays them, which highlights them. And in this chaos, the average team really suffers. And this is just something that other killers just don't have. The other killers You hook a survivor, they go away, you might not see them for the rest of the game unless you flush them out. They're not going to be flushing themselves out like they have to do against Wesker. So that's pretty damn good on him. Assuming, of course, you play this killer at a high level, I think this position is more than warranted. Moving on to the artist, this is a placement that I'm sure shocks some people that aren't super familiar with her. She's a normal killer with normal terror radius, normal launch, normal everything, and she sends out birds. But the thing about her power is that it's very unintuitive for beginners. If you spam the birds, her cooldowns become bigger and bigger. Every time she sends them out or places them, she slows herself down. And you don't really have a guaranteed way to do damage over distance if you keep missing or if you keep misusing the birds. And for that reason, when you play her wrong, she can feel very unremarkable and honestly rather weak. So if you have seen that kind of gameplay or if you felt that way, let me tell you, that's not all there is to artists. This killer is actually fairly strong and has the ability to use certain perks almost better than anyone else and harass people from distances in a way that almost no other killer can do. And that doesn't make her any less deadly from up close. So let's start from up close. What can this killer do from up close? From up close, her birds will directly damage you, much like a Hunter's hatchet, if they hit you. This means that doing things like body blocking, going in a straight line, going for a window that is a bit far, she can literally hit you much like a Huntress, but with a much, obviously, lesser cooldown than if she had hit you normally. This is a big deal. This also means that any loop is potentially unsafe unless you have a friend helping you to run into the bird or do something really bold. Each loop can be completely disabled by a single bird. If she places a single bird in the correct place and chases you around it, you will get hit if she is patient or good enough. There's also a few add-ons that make this even easier. Notably, we have the Matthias Baby Shoes, which is a purple add-on. With this add-on, the auras of survivors around birds are revealed. And this means that even if she doesn't guess right, she doesn't have to guess. She will see your aura around the bird to the point where even if she is behind a wall, she knows where you are and she'll fire it into your face and hit you every single time. Good artists are very good at minimizing the amount of birds that they can place, that they have to place in a single loop. Maybe just one bird will cover everything they'll have to, so you will probably have to leave. She also has an iridescent add-on that is very powerful but rarely used, called the Garden of Rot. With this add-on, if you take a bird and you get rid of them, you will be insta-downable, which is a lot of pressure. It could come as a surprise early on and give her an easy down. And even though it seems gimmicky, at higher levels, it can be used in very, very cruel ways, and it can really be punishing. On a more long-distance note, this killer is still really brutal. She has the ability to send out birds that will swarm you. A swarm allows her to see where you are for a few seconds at least. And if you get hit again by a set of birds from afar or through a wall, you then take damage. And very crucially, you're interrupted in whatever action you're doing. This means that survivors will learn to fear the birds. If they stay on a generator and they get hit again, not only do they take damage, they get interrupted. This triggers things like Deadman Switch. This interrupts you doing things like totems. So for that reason, this killer is really, really good at defending things from afar. And she even has a few tricks up her sleeve. If you place two birds from a very long distance, they can actually damage a survivor on their own. Two birds, the birds normally have a period where they can't hit the same survivor twice. So if you place bird and bird, the first one will hit, the second one will go through. But if you space them out enough, you can actually hit a survivor on a gen with one bird and then damage him with the next one. She also has an add-on called the Severed Hands, which makes birds spread onto each other. So if you know that there's multiple survivors in one generator, maybe healing in a spot, maybe under the hook after they're rescued, this add-on can swarm multiple survivors. And with this add-on, the distance at which you need to put birds is much lesser. So if you put a bird, wait a little bit and put another bird, if you send them two out, you can actually damage people with that if they're close together. So a lot of implications for that. This also makes body blocking very, very difficult. Survivors will often try to body block for each other with this add-on and infect each other with birds and end up going down both or taking damage both of them. So she has a lot of potential for this kind of play. Auto reading is really powerful on her for the obvious reasons. You can find people healing, hit them from afar. Any perk that triggers from interrupts like Deadman Switch is really useful for obvious reasons. Yeah. Then she has a few other add-ons that complement her playstyles quite well. One add-on to slow down a little bit survivors, one add-on to make her cooldown a little bit better, one add-on to make the removal of birds take a bit longer. It's not a lot of variety, but that's all she really, really needs. Now, her weaknesses lay a little bit in the middle. If a survivor is a little bit far from you, they're not so easy to hit, and this is the point where if you misuse your power, they will constantly loop onto the next area, and you'll be constantly playing a cat and mouse game where you go to a loop, place a bird, they leave for the next one, they drop a pallet, they go for the next one, and this is where you lose games as an artist. This is what you need to avoid, but there are ways to avoid or at least minimize the impact of this playstyle. What you want to do for the most part is snipe certain things, like X-ray certain things with one single bird. If you're in one loop, you can place a bird that covers a window or a pallet and then aims at the next window or pallet that they might reach. Eventually, they will go there, they'll drop the pallet, you send the bird, you hit them, and if you do things right, now you are set up for a follow-up bird that will probably damage them. So yeah, if you manage to learn all of the tricks that you can do with this, you can do a lot of really nasty things. There's also some other creative ways to play artists. You can put certain birds in a way that are basically there to quote unquote body block the survivor. If the survivor goes into them, they get swarmed, and then you do a follow-up. There are some tricks that you can do with this killer that really make her very, very versatile. Some of the more obvious weaknesses, aside from using her power wrong, include maps with multiple elevations. If you have a generator that's on a platform, you cannot easily harass it because your birds don't necessarily go up. So this does come into play sometimes, but you would be surprised there's not that many maps where this is a thing or where this really matters. And there's also a lot of maps like Dead Dog Saloon, where even a little bit of elevation will make a bird hit above their level. The birds are actually fairly generous. You can even hit people on the platform of the gallows from below, which is not something that's super obvious. So when you know all of these things, this killer does have a lot of potential. That being said, she requires a lot of micro-managing decisions. Compared to, for example, Chucky, this killer is not at all easy to play. She requires a lot of good decision making and snap reflexes, and for that reason she's probably not very popular. You probably don't see her very often, and I don't blame you if you think she shouldn't be this high on the tier list. I also wouldn't think very highly of her if I hadn't seen really good tournament survivors get absolutely obliterated by this killer managing to harass them from a distance and dominate them in chase from close up. So yeah, she's sadly a killer that doesn't get a lot of love, but give her a bit of love and she will give back in return. Next up is our current Sadako. Our current Sadako is actually massively overtuned in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, in the next patch, she will be dropping several spots to a more healthy position, but the way she exists right now is really crazy. As you can see, her potential doesn't go that much higher. She doesn't ever get to compete with the strongest killers in the game because ultimately she doesn't have a chase power that is insane or anything like that. But she is an absolute noob stomper and an even decent stomper of arguably good teams as well. So the way the current Sadako works right now, the reason why she's probably getting nerfed is because she's extremely oppressive with her Condemn while still having a bit of stealth and mobility. She has the ability to teleport around the map with her TBs. Outside of that, she also has a bit of stealth, which especially in indoor maps or against lesser organized teams helps. But every time she teleports, she builds up Condemn. Every time you teleport, you build 0.75 points of Condemn. So you teleport twice, you build up 1.5. You teleport 4 times, you build 3. Eventually, when survivors reach 7, they get highlighted, and if you down them, you can mori them. And obviously, survivors have to avoid this. So one way to avoid this is to pick up a tape. If they pick up a tape, the teleport doesn't affect them. But then if you hit them, they gain 2 points of Condemn. So basically, in order to relieve themselves from the poison that is the condemn, they have to drink the poison first. So if a survivor is in a really, really bad spot and they have been allowed to build the condemn too highly, then they have to go for a TB to pick up a tape. And at that point, there are add-ons that allow you to know that they're doing this, or even just normal awareness. At that point, you will focus on that survivor, you will hit that survivor, and that survivor will be either fully condemned or very close to fully condemned. And you don't even need to hook them. You can leave them on the ground or let them be. When you hit them, their TB tape disappears, so they have to do it again. And there's no way for teammates to take care of them. This is a killer that can demanifest and go through survivors. So it is a perfect killer for you to completely ignore altruism plays and focus on that person. Not to mention that if people get too altruistic, they'll eventually find themselves condemned as well. So basically, the problem with this killer that makes her so strong, and the reason why she's getting banned, is because you don't need to think about this much at all. You can just teleport around the map, hit people as you see them, maybe defend gens as you see them a little bit, and eventually someone will be in a vulnerable spot. You poke them a little bit, and they're very likely to die. With 4 gens left, you can more condemn someone, and there's no way for them to realistically avoid this. The way in which players are expected to beat Sadako, the way that they can make her weaker and drop her down significantly in the tier list is by, number 1, not falling for any ambush attacks. Number 2, picking up tapes almost immediately as soon as it's possible. Keep in mind, in some maps, it's very difficult. In some maps, finding tapes, like in Midwich, is super difficult because you don't know where the gens are. You can't find them. Maybe you find a TB, but the TB has already been turned off. So it's very, very difficult in some maps, but they have to find a tape, and then they need to hold on to the tape, but also not get hit. Very critically. And then give you a good chase. If you go against a really good team that is organized, that can absolutely happen. I'm not saying that that's impossible. But for the most part, teams are going to have one weak link or one person that makes a mistake or one tiny slip up, and this killer will take advantage of that ravenously. Unlike other killers that we've talked about mostly so far, you don't have to commit to one person. You can literally just spam the teleport until someone becomes the obvious target. And sometimes it might be someone you don't even expect. So yeah, for this reason, she was really powerful. She has 2 particular add-ons right now that are, I think, the ones that really stand out. One of them allows you to know when and where a survivor is trying to get rid of a tape, and that basically marks them for death. And the other one makes them have to pick up the tape and deliver it to the furthest TB. Not the closest TB, the furthest. One of the ways that Sadako can honestly be beaten, and somewhat easily, is if you get a really good map as a survivor. If you get a really good map as a survivor that has some great loops, like say Garden of Joy, sometimes you might have 2 TBs that are genuinely right next to each other. And one survivor that is in a tough spot could pick up a tape from one and then put it into the other, and then they're fine for the time being. With this iridescent add-on, that can never happen. If you pick up a TB tape, you will always have to go across the map. And good luck doing that. Because the teleport is so spammable, she can easily figure out where you are and catch you somewhere in between. If you're going to a TB and she knows which TB it is, she can also teleport to that TB and make it impossible for you to use it. So yeah, that's a lot of stuff. The thing is, Sadako herself is fairly weak in chase in this current iteration. She has a lullaby that allows survivors to hear her from afar if they pay attention. Her invisibility add-ons were some of them were nerfed, so she wasn't all that strong. But it doesn't matter. You can make up for that weakness by chasing other people that are less prepared or bringing chase perks. That's basically how I played her. I brought chase perks to make the hits really difficult to avoid, and make that one weakness kind of covered, and everything else, float very naturally to the point where even really good teams struggled. If this Sadako was allowed to continue in the game, there are some things that survivors could do. There are actually some tricks. For example, if you go into a locker or down yourself with a perk plot twist, that doesn't count towards condemn. So if you have a tape and you're about to get hit, you can go into a locker to not take 2 points of condemn. This is a kind of counterplay that teams would eventually have to learn. But what's going to happen is that Sadako in the next patch is getting nerfed and you won't have to deal with any of this. So most of what I'm saying right now is kind of pointless. In the next patch, her condemn is actually on the weaker side. Picking up tapes has no real downsides unless you get hooked. And even if you do get hooked, it's not that big of a deal. So she's going to be a much more manageable killer moving forward. Now, next is Pyramid Head. This killer has changed remarkably little. In the current version of the game, there's a somewhat nasty bug that makes his camera really wobbly and unnaturally looking. I'm going to assume that this is corrected. It would be kind of sad to assume that it's there to stay. Yeah, what's the deal with this killer? This killer has a few things going for him that haven't changed over the years. Number one, he has the ability to hit you almost anywhere. His Punishment of the Damned goes through walls. It doesn't cover gaps. It doesn't go uphill, but it can hit you through most loops, most windows, most everything. If you spam this power and don't use it with any mind, it's somewhat unreliable, but if you are good and patient and know where to make educated guesses, this power is very oppressive. Survivors that make mistakes get hit immediately. Survivors that group up or come up the basement stairs together, they will get hit, multiple of them, because this attack can hit multiple survivors and be punished very, very directly, no pun intended. And even good survivors will be forced to make subpar decisions. Even good survivors don't have a lot of resources against this Punishment of the Damned attack. On top of that, if he manages to torment you by making you step on his trail, which you don't have to do, but if he manages to make you do this, you will now be susceptible to his secondary power, which is the cages. Instead of hooking you, he can put you on a cage, and this counts as a hook for pretty much all intents and purposes, except for perks. He cannot use perks on cages, and cages also deny all perks that survivors would normally get. They don't get Deliverance, they don't get Will Make It, they don't get Borrowed Time, they don't get Kindred, they don't get any of that when they're in a cage. Cages did receive a minor nerf somewhat recently, where camping them is now harder. It used to be very easy for this killer to camp a cage, and if a survivor got rescued, they were dead, and if they didn't get rescued, they would die. Now, if you stay a little bit too close, the cage will go away, and the distance at which you need to stay has been enhanced. It has been increased. So camping cages is a little bit harder, but it's still something that you could do from a bit of a distance. And it's a place, the playstyle of tunneling someone out of a cage or caging them after a hook to ignore perks like Decisive Strike and other anti-tunneling perks is still very much alive. Now, I have to say, the average pinhead that I see play is not that strong. They use their power in chase somewhat effectively, but they don't play too mean. The real strength of this killer, in my very modest opinion, is in his ability to use passive slowdown perks to slow down the game without doing much. Say Corrupt, Deadlock, Ruin, even quite popular in him. I expect to be even more popular soon. And use these perks to slow down the game while you catch one person, maybe torment them, force them to be tormented in some way, and very, very zealously defend the hook. If you have the anti-camping hook mechanic, obviously this doesn't work, but if you keep a bit of a distance and you manage to defend the hook and maybe put even a bit of trails around the hook, it does force survivors sometimes to be in a lose-lose situation where if they want to rescue, they have to be tormented. If they don't rescue, that person's now on second stage and they will be tunneled very relentlessly. And this is the kind of situation where the average team falls apart completely. And playing in this manner is what I think elevates this killer a little bit more. The obvious ability to avoid hook perks and whatnot is also a bit of a plus. Some killers ignore this part altogether, the caging, and they just go for normal hooks, and I think that works out fine sometimes, but yeah. That's basically all there is. In terms of add-ons, he has a few add-ons that are reliable and nothing else. He has no nuclear options, no insane iridescent or purple add-on. So in that regard, I think his potential doesn't reach as high as some other killers, but he's still fairly strong and in some scenarios quite scary. I think honestly the biggest thing about this killer is that if the person behind it is good, lucky, or both, you have no place in the map where you are genuinely safe. The only thing that keeps you safe is the distance. In fact, good survivors will typically get to a loop and not even want to be caught on the pallet. They will literally drop the pallet early because they know that it's easier to play around the drop pallet sometimes than it is to try to drop it against him. If you give him possession of the pallet, if he can be on the pallet while it's up, that's typically a hit or a torment or both. So yeah, that's the main strength of this killer, and it's something that not a lot of other killers have. Moving on, we have the Huntress, a killer with a tremendously high skill ceiling, an assortment of fairly deadly add-ons, and with a wide variety of them. That's not a common thing. Some killers have bad add-ons, some killers have one or two good add-ons, but there's not a lot of characters that have several good add-ons to the point where you don't necessarily know if someone was really sweating with this killer. You don't necessarily know what they're gonna bring. You can bring extra hatchets, shorter cooldown, which is really deadly and really enhances her ability to do hit with her hatchet and then hit with her basic attack, or hatchet. Out of reading, which is powerful. Insta down, which I think against the average team is extremely mean if you're good at it. And also a few other things such as mangled effect and so on. So wide variety of add-ons. You might remember that recently her reloading speed was buffed. She's now 1 second faster at reloading in lockers. That is more than welcome. She still has a small 20-meter turret radius, which makes her not so good with perks like Ultimate Weapon. And a lullaby that never goes away, which means that you're never really gonna stealth with this killer. That's not a thing you can do, even though she does have some cute ways to be a bit more unpredictable, such as using the Fox add-on, especially in indoor maps, to catch people off guard. But for the most part, what this killer comes down to, she has the ability to hit people from afar, which enables a lot of punishing situations where survivors get hit while unhooking from afar, get interrupted while doing totems, maybe take free damage because they make a slight misplay or the killer gets lucky. And from up close, she's fairly deadly as well. If a loop doesn't have high tall walls and structures, you are likely to be hit on it. And the gameplay much revolves around getting to shack. Well, even shack's not that safe. Getting to structures like shack and having enough distance ahead of time so that you don't get caught vaulting a window or having to drop a pallet or vault a pallet, because that's where you're going to get hit 9 times out of 10 if this killer knows what they're doing. The skill ceiling to this killer honestly comes down to those places where the hit isn't super obvious, but it's still possible. There are a lot, and I mean a lot of places in almost every map where a good Huntress that has a lot of experience knows that they can throw a hatchet through a small gap or over a tall wall that looks tall enough to protect you, but is actually not. The reverse is also true. There are places where it looks like you can throw a hatchet, and a beginner Huntress would try, but an experienced Huntress knows that the hitbox is actually deceiving, and you cannot, so they don't even try, and they are down to business. So, considering that she has a decent scary chase power, but that also she has to reload. She has no stealth. She has below average mobility because she's 110. Why is this killer doing so high in the tier list? It seems like other killers that we'll talk about later might actually be higher. The real thing about this killer, the thing that I think elevates her and sets her apart from other range killers, like for example, say Deathslinger, is just the sheer amount of punishment that you can dish in just a second. With this killer, especially with cooldown hatchets, but even without, you have an uncanny ability to do damage through health states very fast. Make basement on hooks nearly impossible. The best teams in the world, if there is someone basement in Huntress and she's camping, they will let her die. They will let that person die. They will let her do the camping. And from that distance, anti-camping doesn't work very well. So her ability to camp strategically, her ability to punish people in the open, her ability to shut down, like maybe find 2 people healing and get them both down really quickly. That ability to explosively destroy survivors when they make one tiny mistake sometimes is what I think makes this killer so high up in the tier list. You could argue that against the best teams in really bad maps, there are a few maps with maybe bad locker placements and so on. You could argue that the Hunter suffers there, but as you'll see, that will be a trend for most killers coming from now on. Most killers coming from now on are going to have some sort of weakness, and most of them are going to lack that explosive ability to really punish survivors. Even if they make a mistake, some other killers just cannot do that much about it. Moving on to one of our recent arrivals, the Xenomorph. This is a really interesting killer. I think my placement on this tier list hinges on your ability to do 2 things. If you do not do these two things, the Xenomorph, I think, easily drops down a few more spots. So listen very carefully. Number one, be able to keep your power up as often as possible. If you do not use the tunnels to prepare your power and get the crawler mode, the one where the Xenomorph can actually use your tail to attack. If you lose this power often by not using the tunnels or by constantly getting hit by turrets, this killer immediately drops in utility and strength because you will be a normal killer with no real power, and the time that the survivor spends setting up the turrets will be more than worth it. And another thing that will make you horrible as this killer is if you miss your tail often. If a survivor is in the open, there's not that much reason to go for a tail attack. You can get them, like, don't be stupid. Just hit them with a basic attack if there's not a huge incentive to do otherwise. And if a survivor is in a good loop, don't lose your head trying to hit them when it's impossible. If you play this killer efficiently and you know how to stay in power by avoiding turrets, and you know when not to use your tail, and you know when to use it, and when you use it you are accurate, now we're talking. This is the moment where this killer gets really accurate. So how do you do both of these things? First one, turrets. Turrets will alert survivors of your location. If you play killer in a very passive way with Xenomorph, survivors will get a head start. They'll know where you're coming. They'll know to run away. You're not going to do so well. You need to use your portals very aggressively. You need to keep in mind that turrets give your location away with their little beeping sound, and you need to be prepared for the turrets. It's not crazy at all to bring one add-on at least to protect against turrets. There are two add-ons in particular that are really good. The best one is Lambert's Map of Stars. In my opinion, this add-on allows you to get closer to a turret before it starts firing at you. And if you hit a turret with your tail, that's okay, but it does give you a long cooldown. A much better strategy, if you can, with this add-on, is to hit the turret that a survivor plays with your basic attack. This gives you a much shorter cooldown and allows you to stay in chase more often. If you find yourself going chasing a survivor, and then they have a turret, and then you break it, and then you keep chasing, and then next turret, and then you break it, and then you keep chasing, and then next turret, and nothing's happening, try this. Try breaking the turrets with your basic attacks whenever possible, and you will stay in your power more often. Once you stay in your power, next step is to be very accurate with your tail. The hitbox on this killer is diagonally tilted downwards. This means that you can actually hit over obstacles where survivors would normally be hiding behind, and get hits that other ranged killers cannot get. And you can also drag your tail slightly, very similar to Nemesis, in a way that makes some tail hits almost unavoidable. If you are absolutely on point with your tail attacks, survivors have very little to do. They have to play against you in a very similar way to how they play against Pyramid Head. They need to get to a loop that's really strong, like Shack, and drop the pallet early. If they wait, they get hit. If they keep running, they get hit. They have to drop a pallet, and then you get rid of the pallet. And this is where your weaknesses begin. If survivors last a long time, they have a lot of resources, and you have a bad map, this killer begins to suffer a little bit. However, if you find the survivors in the more vulnerable spots, if the map is not incredible, if you know to use your portals for mobility, maybe have some perks, or even good game sense to find survivors naturally where they might be, or even just pay attention to the footsteps that play over you, you will be able to catch them off guard more often than not and be in good chases. And this killer is just disgusting then. As for add-ons, other than the ones to help with turrets, I don't frankly see any add-on that is incredibly game-changing. Much like, for example, Wesker, the best add-ons enhance the gameplay a little bit, but they don't give you insta-down on the tail. They don't give you 20% faster attack speed or recovery or range or anything like that. So that does keep the alien a little bit grounded. He never really shoots up to compete with the strongest killers in the game. But the ability to cover the map with portals and the semi-stealth that you get from that and all that does keep you as a fairly okay killer, even in some maps that would otherwise be bad. That's my take on Alien. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. Be accurate with your tail and stay in power, and he's pretty good. And the things that make mind you, the things that you could bring up against Xenomorph, like, oh, this map having too much safety or these pallets being too safe, those are things that will affect the other killers that we'll see in the list as well. So his weaknesses are, or their weaknesses, or its weaknesses are not really unique. Now moving on to our next killer, who is also a new arrival, the Singularity. So the Singularity sadly suffers from a similar problem as the Artist, for example, where he is a little bit too difficult to play for the average person to really get most of his value out. In fact, many people place this killer really low on their tier list, and in the statistics that we know of, he has a very low kill rate. So it's understandable that if you've only seen a few Singularities out in the wild, you might think that he's quite average or even below average. But let me tell you, if you play this killer correctly, if you're willing to put in a lot of work and adjust to its very mechanically demanding and cognitively demanding power, you can actually get pretty close to being one of the best killers in the game. No joke. This killer is quite strong if you're ready to use your brain. You will have to use your brain though, because he has a power that requires you to be in multiple places at once. On top of being a normal killer with the average cell radius, normal lunge, and all that stuff, he places biopods around the map, which are basically cameras. You can use these cameras to quickly check around yourself for reconnaissance, knowing if a survivor is there, if a gen's being done. And the cameras allow you to infect survivors with your slipstream. A survivor that is infected can now be teleported too. If you hit them with that camera or another camera or directly with your gun, you appear next to the survivor. The way these appearances work is a bit interesting. Basically, survivors have like a shadow behind them. Every time they move, the shadow follows them. And, the shadow is behind them like by about a meter or so, or a certain amount of time. And when you teleport, you appear right where they were about a second ago. It's not exactly that, but that's basically how it works. And when you appear next to them, you have this overclock state where you are immune to pallet stuns. If a pallet is dropped on you, you automatically insta-break it and normally get a hit. And even if they drop the pallet before you get there, you break it really quick. You also do other things really quick, such as vault windows, very fast, kick pallets, kick walls, and kick gens even, if you ever need to do that. So during that time, you're kind of like superhuman. You don't have any unnatural speed, however. That's the main thing about this killer. If you keep teleporting behind survivors and they keep vaulting windows and you keep chasing behind them, you don't have any crazy speed or anything like that. So you could be teleporting to survivors and misplaying it and getting nowhere. And that is a really easy mistake to make. You need to be a bit precise and know when to teleport and what is the right time to do it. And obviously, if you're very good at placing your cameras around the map, you will be able to use them strategically in chase to be really quick, as opposed to having to set up 20 cameras in every chase multiple times, which is really not ideal. You want to set up cameras very, very strategically. Maybe if a camera is no longer needed, you can even remove it on the spot. And that's where the cognitive demands of this killer really kick in. You need to be aware of your cameras, not place too many, remove the ones that are not necessary. Survivors have a tool called the EMP to remove your cameras. So you need to be aware of which ones might have been removed. Do not use them if possible, replace them if possible, and so on and so forth. This gets difficult. This gets tricky. And this is probably the part where some killers just think it's too much and they stop. However, the more advanced players, they keep up with all of these demands, and then they start using the few add-ons on this killer that make him a little bit better. There's one of them in particular that stands out, that is it's such a good add-on that if you ask any Singularity players, they probably run it all the time because it's basically a straight upgrade. It's called the Soma Family Photo. This add-on makes it so that when you teleport on top of a survivor, you actually get a speed boost for a little while. It does have a minor downside, but it doesn't matter too much. So this actually makes this killer quite powerful, because now when you teleport to a survivor, it's much harder for them to not have to drop the pallet on top of you and get hit anyway. On top of this, there are a few perks that can make this even scarier. With, for example, Rapid Brutality from the Xenomorph. When you hit a survivor, you will now be faster by default, and then you'll be faster by this add-on when you teleport to them. So when you teleport, you will be moving at a much higher speed than a normal killer, and then a hit there becomes unavoidable. So this killer has the ability to make chase very, very difficult, especially with these add-ons. And at a higher level, he actually becomes really scary at defending areas. In competitive play, and for some very dedicated individuals, you might sometimes witness Singularities putting cameras around their 3 gens, around the end game, around certain maybe totems that they want to defend, and getting rid of these, especially if he's already killed one person and you're in a 3v1, is really, really tough. This is not the main part of his strength, but it's something that he can do occasionally strategically to make a game all the more difficult. The counterplay to this killer, if played really, really correctly, is difficult, relies on teamwork, relies on correct EMP usage, relies on not getting tagged by cameras too much, or not spreading the infection slips into other survivors, which you can do accidentally if you get too close to them. And good survivors struggle against this killer sometimes. I personally find him one of the hardest killers to play against when you really know what you're doing. So yeah, it mostly comes down to your ability to meet these demands, and he climbs up, or your inability to live up to them, and which, by the way, is completely fine. This is a very difficult killer, and then he feels a bit more average. Up to you. Ultimately, strong killer, but add-on dependent and a little bit map dependent as well. Some maps are beautifully open and allow you to place cameras that flow into each other perfectly. You have 3 cameras and you cover basically every angle. And some other maps, such as Hawkins, are hallway, 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 hallway. You need a camera everywhere, and even then you don't see properly. So yeah, difficult in those situations. But again, being map dependent is something that will happen more and more as we go down the killer list. Continuing to go down, we now reach the Hag. The Hag is a very unique killer. Almost every other killer in the game, you want to stay away from for as long as possible. If for example, Nurse is wandering around the map, you want to be on gens, or you want to hide, or a combination of both. And that is almost always the right idea. With Hag, however, she is a setup killer that will set up traps that can hurt the team a lot later down the line. You actually need people in some degree or another to harass her, to mess with her, to mess with the traps that she's playing. When you play Hag and you go against good teams, you notice that at least one person dedicates almost full time to doing this, so that they know where your traps are and they can disarm them, maybe bait you into chasing a person that you can't really chase. In that scenario, by the way, if that happens, the Hag drops very dramatically. If the survivors adapt very quickly, or even know ahead of hand that you're a Hag, they can start to do this and work as a team, and things get hard. In tournaments, for example, Hag is very difficult to play because survivors typically know that it's a Hag. So from the very beginning of the game, they will play extremely slow. Anytime they get hit, they will go to the one area they know is safe. They'll take 25 minutes to play it out and heal every time. And in those situations, the Hag is a killer that doesn't have any insane chase power or anything. So in those situations, Hag drops down very significantly. But let me tell you, in your average public match, which is what this tier list is based on, that almost never happened. Even good survivors don't expect the Hag. Needless to say, average survivors don't really see Hags very often. They're very, very unusual. So they're not ready or don't know how to play around her powers, ideally. So you can see her be much, much stronger on average than what I just described. So the average team will typically not harass you too much, will let you place a few good traps, might not even know how to harass you properly, or might try to harass you and give you free hits or free downs, which will start the whole thing going. And eventually, when you have a few traps around the map, you will try to poke them, chase them, see if you can harass them into the area that you've set up. Maybe they'll have to enter that area because you have a totem there, or gens there that they need to do, or better yet, a person on the hook that they need to unhook. And that's where things get a little bit hairy. If you get people injured and they start stepping on traps and they don't have healing items, things get hairy. In the past, with Boon Circle of Healing being really powerful, even solo players could honestly outplay you very often. They would take a hit and they would naturally go to their boon area that is safe typically and heal themselves there, but that's no longer the case. Survivors don't have a lot of self-healing options. If they bring them, they are sometimes limited. They maybe have 1 or 2 heals in a medkit, and when you grind them down a little bit and they find themselves injured, they hope that someone else goes for the rescue, that one person might get injured, that no one can go for the rescue, and even though people tell me all the time that this killer is really weak because they judge her at her weakest, when I play this killer, I feel so much more powerful than most of the other killers in the cast. I have so many games where I lose 2 gens, so I feel really confident. They take 2 hits, they take 2 downs, the game is over, everyone's on the ground, no one can recover. She creates situations that are really, really tough. She's really good at camping basements, she's really good at camping corners of a map. In indoor maps, her traps are hard to avoid, even if you know they're there. If you're being pushed into them, you have no choice. Say Midwich or Hawkins, the maps are pretty small. She can teleport to almost every map set on the map because her teleport distance covers almost everything, and you don't really have a way to avoid it. I didn't mention this, but obviously, if you have 3 people on a team that are really careful and 1 person that is really careless, the person that is careless will often go down, put themselves on the hook, and now rescuing them makes everyone else, even if the other people are better, have to get down and dirty and possibly make mistakes. And on top of this ability to just mess with teams and force them into mistakes, she now has a few new add-ons that make her a little bit more unpredictable. On top of her already good add-ons that she had before, trap teleporting distance, trap setting speed, auto reading, all of these shackles, which makes her traps not give a notification, which can sometimes give you grabs out of out of a generator. Happens sometimes. On top of all of these add-ons that she's had for many years, she now has an iridescent add-on that makes her move at 117.5%. So she has an add-on that makes her an M1 killer that is better than most M1 killers with a small turret radius. Even this is somewhat usable and somewhat unpredictable. So she now has a few new tools in that sense. One thing that happened relatively recently, a few months ago, is that the traps that she sets are no longer vulnerable to flashlights. In the past, survivors could use a flashlight to disarm traps from a distance really, really quickly, even in chase sometimes, and that was really useful. That's why in the past, hacks used to run Franklins to make their flashlights fall off their hands. You don't have to do that anymore. The traps now are invulnerable to flashlights. Survivors can remove them manually, but it takes a long time. And at that point, you're no longer worried about items as much. Medkits are also much weaker than before, so and boons, as I mentioned, are basically not useful to the same degree as they were before. So you have a meta that is honestly really decent for hack right now. Up to you, ultimately. She's not a very popular killer, not because she's weak, I think, but because the strategic and passive nature of her power is just not something that I think most people enjoy. But that is honestly to your advantage, because it really does mean that the players that you go against really don't know how to play against her. Now, talking about killers that people don't know how to play against, the Skull Merchant. What a difficult killer to classify. This killer is all over the place. She got reworked recently, and she has an almost she gets this almost visceral reaction from survivors that, like, I don't think there's any other killer where survivors give up against more. It's a combination of her old reputation. Back in the day, the Skull Merchant was incredibly good at holding 3 gens and making the games take forever. People found that really unfun. 2 things have changed since. She's been reworked, and she no longer has that insane ability. And a 3-gen change is coming in the next update, so that playstyle should be either dead or with 1 foot in the grave. But the reputation still remains. The 3-genning can still be done to some degree. And she has a lot of new things in her base kit that are so obtuse, that are so difficult to grasp, that survivors really don't learn, that survivors really don't understand, and they seem like unwilling to. That's why you see so many people give up. But we're going to try to place this killer in an objective way, even though it's very difficult, because subjectively, she's possibly the strongest killer in the game right now. Subjectively, she makes people give up more than anyone else. But if we look at her power objectively, what can we get out of it? So she is a hybrid killer that has the normal stats of every other average killer, but she also becomes stealthy when setting a drone. She also finds the location of survivors in her little radar when drones pick them up. She also gets a speed boost when survivors get tagged by these drones. She also makes the survivors slow down at certain points. She also injures survivors. If the survivors were already injured when they get scanned, they get deep wound. If they also get broken, so they can't heal immediately. They also give off killer instinct. Do you see the problem? There's so much going on. There's so much going on. So yeah, that's as far as the survivors are concerned, they really struggle to understand how to play against the killer. Now, from the killer POV, how strong is she? She's fairly strong. In indoor maps and against uncoordinated teams, the stealth alone is fairly good. The occasional speed boosts alone are fairly good. The simplest thing that you can do is just put your drones randomly around the map to maybe cause trouble down the line and just approach gens stealthily and get free hits every now and then. The other very simple thing that you can do is go to a loop that is relatively low, the kind of loop where hunters would be able to hit you with a hatchet, for example. And then just put a drone. If you put a drone in the loop and the survivor keeps going around it, eventually they'll get injured, which is already good for you. They might even drop the pallet and still get injured. And if they're injured, they'll become slowed down, deep wounded, and all of this stuff. This means that they can't use certain perks, they cannot heal on the spot, and when they get slowed down, you, especially combined with your speed push, you will eventually overpower them. Survivors, one of the reasons they really hate this killer as well is because they cannot play a loop. They have to leave it. And when they leave it, you can choose to go for someone else, or you can tag them with your drone partially. And this is the very cruel thing about Skull Merchant. If a survivor takes a tag from a drone, it doesn't go away over time. So a survivor can go into the open and get hit by a drone that they didn't know was there, or get hit by a drone mid-chase, and then later on, randomly run into another drone and take damage. At the worst possible time, they take damage. And now they can't heal. They can't go for the rescue. They have to go and heal, and everything falls apart. So in this very simple way, this killer wouldn't be insanely strong or anything. There's definitely things survivors can do in chase. They can crouch underneath the race. They can stand still. There's things they can do to try to delay it or mitigate. They can just run away, as I mentioned. But this killer also has a few aces up her sleeve. Number one, she can change the direction of the drones to make sure that hitting someone around a loop is even more consistent. There's also a little trick that at this point, I'm going to call it a tech. There's a way for the Skull Merchant to injure people even if the drone doesn't physically touch the survivor. If you set a drone and you are or you change the direction of a drone and you are directly in front of a survivor and you're directly looking at them, you need to be looking at them. This is really crazy. I can't believe I explained this. You will sometimes injure the survivor or attack the survivor before they actually get hit by the actual spinning ray of detection. This allows you to sometimes injure a survivor and then very quickly hit them, or follow up and quickly hit them. All of this stuff makes her unpredictable. Her rays also go through gaps. So for example, if you place a drone on some stairs, the drone rays will go through the staircase gaps and hit someone behind them. You can also put them on slight elevations, and they actually hit somewhat below them, not multiple floors. Like, it will not be able to hit a survivor above, but you can hit survivors from really sneaky angles as well. So all of this complexity makes it so that anytime you're in chase, you're doing something. You're becoming stealthy and going for someone else. You're getting tagged some people. Clumsy survivors will maybe go across the map and not notice the rays on the ground and get hit. Even if you notice them, sometimes you can stack drones really close to each other. I found myself in situations where I see a gen and there's like 3 drones around them. And yeah, I can sneak my way into it, but when the killer shows up at some point, I'm going to have to run. And when I run, I'm going to give her damage at some point because I'll get hit by the race. So all of this stuff is just tough. She has a few add-ons to add more status effects, which further complicates everything, even though those are not the strongest. She has a few add-ons to make the slowdown more brutal, to make the race hit you more frequently if you get hit by them quickly in quick succession, and very simple add-ons that are just easy to use. And that's the thing, compared to other killers, even if you play Skull Merchant in a very simple way, you get decent results. People struggle, and for that reason, I place her this high. I still have a feeling that if we were a bit more rational and we weren't so traumatized by how strong and annoying this killer used to be, we would probably see this killer a little bit lower. But as I said, there are quite a few tricks and things that you can do to make this killer get sneaky hits and get sneaky drone tags that have a bit of a skill ceiling to them. So yeah, easy to play, but also has a decent skill ceiling to her, and very very obviously annoying to go against, judging by the survivor reaction. Next up is the Cenobite, aka Pinhead from the Hellraiser series. This is a killer that has the average attributes of 32 meters, 115% movement speed, and shares some of the normal weaknesses that most average killers have. But he's also a bit of a jack of all trades. One of the reasons why he's a pretty well-rounded killer that still has a decently high potential is because he does a bit of everything. With his passive ability, he can delay the game a little bit. He can find information. He can make survivors oblivious every now and then. He has a bit of anti-loop. He has even a teleport that happens occasionally. All of these things together do compound into a fairly interesting killer. He is also, I think, a little bit hard to play. But you can always rely on simpler playstyles. You don't need, unlike other killers like Singularity, where you need to learn his power and use it very well. This killer can be played in different ways, and all of them are valid, and all of them are fairly decent. Now, let's talk about what is the most unavoidable part of his power, the box. The box is a passive element of his power that sits in the background. It spawns at the start of the game and later at periods. Depending on how survivors interact with it. And if you leave it alone, the box will eventually start a chain hunt that harasses survivors. Survivors cannot do gens, they cannot heal, they can't even loop sometimes because they get hit by them. So in order to be able to be back into their normal states, they have to find the box and solve it, and that goes on a little break. However, that alone is pretty good. However, if the Pinhead is good, and if they have a good grip on the game, what they're going to try to do is either try to find the box first. If Pinhead finds the box, he immediately kicks it into working. Or once a survivor has picked it up, they'll try to prevent the box from being used. Sometimes you will see a Pinhead teleport to the box, which also counts as solving it, and that's okay strategically sometimes. But the big idea behind the box is to prevent it from being done, to keep it going constantly. If a survivor picks up the box, and then they go down, the box gets reset and then reappears. And then if another survivor picks it up and then he gets in, and then they go down as well, then the whole cycle continues. A really good Pinhead player against survivors that are struggling can keep this going for the entire game. Sometimes at the start, based on perks or intuition, you can find the box, get it going, and then never from that point on let the box be solved. And if you manage to do that, that is absolutely incredible, and this killer feels incredibly oppressive. Sometimes it is easier for a killer to keep the box going than it is for some solo players that are not very coordinated to solve it. So this is also a killer that really benefits from uncoordinated teams and solo players. Now, once the survivors get smarter, they are not going to be stupid. They will ignore the box as long as it takes, not make it too obvious, not pick it up at a time when it's easy to be interrupted. When someone has gone down and the killer is busy, then they'll do the box, where it's either impossible to teleport to in time, or impossible to interrupt it in time, or just not viable at that point. Also, if this is quite obvious, but if the person that picks up the box is a really good person in chase when it comes to their experience, sometimes downing them is much harder than it might seem. Sometimes you might spend 2 minutes chasing a guy with the box only for all the gems to be done, and in the end game the box doesn't really prevent the gates from being done or anything like that. So at that point you've lost the game. So you need to be a little bit smart, and sometimes the best idea is to just go for someone else, let the box be solved this one time, and then maybe contest it the next. On top of this though, this killer also has the Possessor Chain ability. He can send out a portal that works very similar to Nurse, and then from this portal he sends a chain, and this chain can hit survivors, and a few things happen. I mean, first of all, you can use this portal just to check things. Believe it or not, you can use the portal, check something, and then just cancel it. So you can use it as a tool to gather information. Sometimes maybe information on a platform or through a wall that you couldn't otherwise. If you hit a survivor with a chain, even from a very long distance, this interrupts them. It's not a good idea to chain people from a distance. You don't really gain much from it, but it can be used to interrupt them. So you can interrupt people doing gens to trigger certain perks. You can interrupt them doing totems, which is really critical. Or the main use for the chain at a distance, interrupt them during the box. So the box takes a few seconds to complete. If you there's add-ons to make it take even longer. If you manage to hit a survivor with the chain, now that box is interrupted. They have to start again, and by then you probably get close and finish the deal. So yeah, that's really good. From up close, the chain is also used as an anti-loop tool. When you hit someone with a chain, more chains spawn and they kind of lock the survivor in place. Especially in the open, the chains are hard to break, so you will gain a lot of distance and quickly hit them. Around loops, it's a bit more complicated because the chains can be broken by bumping into walls and trees and stuff. So if you use the chains around, for example, Shack, and you hit a survivor and they vault the window, they will get rid of the chains right away, and they're very likely to dodge the follow-up chains that spawn. So the anti-loop of this killer is a little bit inconsistent, but knowing how to use it helps. When you know that the chains have a certain logic and that they break if you run into them, you start to put 2 and 2 together and you hit them from the right and then approach from the left and use chains from this angle so they're less likely to break, and so on and so forth. And, you know, they do become a fairly good tool for anti-chase. Not as incredibly powerful as some of the S or A tier killers, but definitely something useful and something that it's hard to shake off for survivors that other weaker killers have no access to. So for that reason, this killer swivels a little bit between really high potential and fairly average outcomes depending on how good you are at harassing the box. His add-ons are okay-ish. They're actually fairly strong. Luckily, we have 2 add-ons historically that were really, really strong, and some of them and 2 of them have been nerfed to this point. Originally, this killer had an iridescent add-on that allowed you to just injure survivors with your chain. So it had no downsides. You hit a survivor with your chain, and if they're healthy, they just take damage. That was absolutely bonkers and made this killer at higher levels unbelievably good. They nerfed this add-on, and it now has a very severe downside to where you probably don't want to use it. Unless you really know what you're doing. And then add-on number 2 was the Original Pain. The Original Pain is a little nail that is a purple add-on, and this add-on allows you to tunnel people off the hook immediately. Back then, if a survivor became unhooked, you could hit them with the chain immediately, and this put them into Deep Wound, and in Deep Wound, next hit downs them no matter what. So you had an add-on that was basically a free license to tunnel anyone, and this was really, really dirty. I think that in the previous tier list, this killer, probably one of the things that propped him up was the fact that he was so dangerous with that one add-on, but that add-on has also been nerfed. It doesn't work on people off the hook anymore. There's a very big 3 second, which is it's pretty big, a fairly big 3 second window period of grace where survivors cannot be hit by chains. So he's not a tunneling machine anymore. That is a good thing, by the way. Not complaining about that. His other add-ons around the purple range are where they really, really shine. There's also some green add-ons that are fairly good. If you use these add-ons to a good degree and manage to harass the box, strong killer, otherwise a little bit weaker. That, I think, about summarizes him. Next up are the twins. And as you can see, their potential is only up. They almost never get worse than this. Even on really bad maps, the twins are fairly consistent and fairly strong, owing to the fact that, they have a strong, quote-unquote, chase power. And they have potential to be among the strongest killer in the game, and in some competitive spheres, the twins are considered one of the craziest, strongest killers in the game, and one of the hardest ones to play against, especially because in those spheres, certain perks are banned, healing is much harder, they don't have multiple medkits and so on. But still, that's still really impressive. Really, really high potential killer. Now, why are they so low if their potential is so high? It's a touchy subject. It's hard to explain. Let's just talk about the positives first so that you get an idea of why they can be so high, and then what everything else brings them back down to. So Charlotte, which is the big twin sister, is basically a normal killer that does normal stuff. With certain add-ons, she becomes stealthy and whatnot, and she can use insta-down perks, any other perk that any other killer can use just fine. And then she detaches from Victor, which is the little guy that is actually a chase machine. Victor moves at 150%. Even faster than that with certain add-ons, can pounce from a distance. And basically, if Victor is such a strong little gremlin, he's such a strong power that when you chase a survivor with very little exceptions, it almost guarantees a hit. The only thing a survivor can do to avoid a hit entirely is to take you so far from Charlotte that they can safely go into a locker. And then at that point, if you hold the locker, they're so far from you that you don't really get anything. But other than that, a hit on Victor is almost unavoidable. For that reason, if the survivors that you play against are a bit slow on the gens, or you bring some perks to make the gens slower, or you make some perks to make the healing slower, and they find themselves in a situation where they are becoming increasingly injured, they are going to fall down. When you attach Victor to a healthy survivor, Victor can be held by the survivor for 30 seconds. So that means that the first hit is not super valuable, okay? But the moment they get injured, Victor doesn't have that anymore. If Victor downs a survivor, he has a cooldown, and then he can go and down someone else. So survivors need to be really scared, similar to Hag, to the situation, arguably scarier than Hag, to the situation where 3 or 4 of them are injured. Because at that point, Victor can go on a little rampage and a little pouncing spree and go pounce, down a survivor, switch back to Charlotte, and now you can't do anything. And things get really ugly. That's why medkits being weaker is a huge boon to the twins. Boon Circle of Healing being basically removed from the meta is also amazing for them. Anti-slugging perks are actually really good against the twins. There are a few of them. Unbreakable to pick yourself up. We're Gonna Live Forever to pick someone else from the ground up. Made for this used to be really popular to pick people up from the ground. No longer anymore. So some of these perks are not super popular, thank goodness, but some of them are not too rare either. Unbreakable is not too rare. For the People Buckle Up is cruel against this killer. But it does mean 2 people are injured now, so it's not too bad. And a few perks like Power Struggle are also rare, but if they are there, they do make this killer harder because, you know, downing people and picking them up. This killer, even though they're good at downing people, they are slow at picking them up. So if you let people on the ground for long and they have perks against that, it hurts. Now, that alone would make the killer a little bit weaker, but they would still probably be comfortably somewhere in the high B or low A tier. Why are they so far down then? This killer is being reworked in a few months, and I think that we can very comfortably expect most of the bugs and issues that currently exist with this killer to not be addressed. There are other killers in the game right now that have one minor bug that I know will be patched, so I don't take it into account very much for the tier list, because it's very likely that it will be gone in a week or 2 or a month. But this killer, I am very confident is going to stay the exact way it is until they get reworked in a few months. And for that reason, I am very keen. I think it's acceptable to consider their bugs and issues as a base kit. Like, we need to consider the bugs. There's no ignoring them when you play this killer. And there's so many of them. That's ultimately what brings this killer down so much. Let's talk about some of the issues with this killer. What is the most prevalent one? The most annoying issue with this killer right now that is somewhat recent is the fact that hitting survivors over obstacles has become much more difficult. For some reason, Victor was able to fly over certain things very easily. If a survivor vaulted a window, you could react to that by starting your pounce and hitting them over the window. If a survivor dropped a pallet, same thing. You could hit them over the pallet. If a survivor vaulted a pallet, same thing. If a survivor was behind some kind of like small obstacle, you could snipe them over it. But this just doesn't work anymore. Victor can no longer go over obstacles easily. Unless you step back like 20 feet or something, you cannot do it. Victor is unable to hit things, to hit survivors over obstacles, which makes his anti-loop, which used to be really good, not as reliable. So that sucks. On top of that, for the longest time, Victor has been really bad at elevation. In a lot of places, Victor will be unable to hit a survivor because he'll get stuck on a very tiny piece of bump on the ground. If a survivor's going upstairs, don't even try it. If a survivor's going downstairs, careful. If a survivor's on a hill, get the math book out and start doing equations, because you need to be very careful. Anytime you go uphill, you're going to get stuck. And that's awful, and it's a part that gets pretty annoying. There was also another bug that I think has been corrected, but who knows, might come back. There was a bug where Victor was unable to see blood for some time, which was annoying. I do think that's corrected. And there's also another bug existing right now that makes it even more likely for Victor to get stuck if there is an object behind him. If there is an object, if you're about to pounce on a survivor, but there's like, say, a tree or some obstacle directly on your back, your hitbox will hit that, and you will do like a little failed attack that just goes nowhere. And yes, during the cooldown, you could be kicked and destroyed. So with all of these quality of life issues and the fact that playing this killer feels so absolutely sluggish with their awful cooldowns, yeah, this killer has a lot of potential, but is ultimately held back by these things and probably others that I forgot to mention. That's it for twins. They are still a force to be reckoned with and somewhat fun if you can get around these issues. Next up is the Deathslinger. The Deathslinger is a fairly strong killer that has quite a few things going for him. He is a hybrid range killer that has a normal terror radius of 32 meters, which can be useful for some perks, but also a movement speed of 110. Even though he hits you with his chain, with his harpoon, he can injure you with both the harpoon and the hit that comes if he just reels you close. That means that he is good at applying basic attack perks. That includes insta-down perks like No One Escapes Death, Make Your Choice, Search, and so on. So he's a bit more versatile and can use builds that other projectile-based killers cannot. And that is honestly pretty awesome. Unfortunately, the saddest part about this killer is that he doesn't have any base kit ability to really punish mistakes in a super fast manner. A lot of people compare this killer to Huntress, and believe it or not, I do agree that at a certain level, especially with survivors being really, really strong, these two killers are fairly close to each other. And in competitive setting, I do think Deathslinger might even have an edge. But in public matches, your wins and your losses many times come down to one survivor making a big mistake or a small mistake and you being able to seal the deal right there and then. And this killer is not as good at doing that. Every time he shoots, he needs to reload. Every time he reels, there's a chance someone might body block. There's a chance you might not hit it. There's the guarantee that it will take a few seconds and you'll need to reload afterwards. Even if everything goes well, he's a bit slow. He does put survivors in the mending state, but for the most part, you are not going to be switching targets. He's not like Legion, where you can make one person men, one person men, one person men, and then go for the fourth guy. That's not mending, and that's pretty efficient. You probably have to commit to the person that you're chasing. In fact, he's actually really good at tunneling people if given the chance, because a lot of loops are unsafe against him. As for add-ons, his add-ons are a little bit deceptive. You might not realize at first glance which add-ons are really good, but once you're a bit more familiar, you'll realize that he has at least a couple options that are really, really nice. They also recently buffed his reload speed by a tiny little bit, not too much, which makes it nice if you go for no add-ons or some creative add-on combinations. So what are some of the add-ons that make him a little bit stronger to the point where he can be pretty high up in the tier list? He has an insta-down add-on that is extremely mean. This insta-down add-on does correct the issue of not having any explosive comeback potential. With the insta-down add-on, if you reel a survivor from about 12 meters or so, I think it's 12 meters, that's not that far. That will happen easily once per game. In some maps, it's hard for survivors not to give it. And insta-downs are mean. They are very, very mean. He also has an add-on that allows him to break his chain and very quickly get back in the action, so that it's not an insta-down, but it's a very favorable position where you injured and you're almost ready to injure or down immediately again. So those are pretty good. And that's basically it. Other than that, and the reload speed and some mangle add-on, everything else is pretty unremarkable. He has some gimmicky add-ons that are more trouble than they're worth. Some add-ons that are generally useless. So yeah, what is the biggest deal with this killer? Survivors splitting up and survivors being generally efficient. He's 110 movement speed. He's no more terror radius. The fact that he has to slow himself down and reload every now and then, that leads to games where survivors will frankly not do very good in the 1v1 because he's a strong 1v1 killer, but will beat you in the 1v4. By the time you have done 2 or 3 good chases, they have done 2 or 3 good gens, and they're not far from using all of their endgame adrenaline perks and plays against you. That is the thing that holds this killer back a little bit. Although in the eyes of some people, if you're an insane Deathslinger main, he could be a little bit higher. I agree with that, but I think on average, he's a little bit lower than the other killers we've discussed. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to him. And now we move on to the next tier, the B-. And this is a big jump. The Wraith used to be placed in my tier list way, way below this. And it is a combination, and as you can see, his variability is fairly tight. He never gets to the point where he's the best killer in the game, but he also never gets to the point where he's bad, almost ever. He has a combination of factors that make him able to withstand maps and situations that are honestly quite damning and quite bad for other killers. Indoor maps that some killers struggle with, he excels at. Big maps that most killers would be extremely terrified of, he actually doesn't mind too much because of his built-in mobility and ease of engagement. You can easily transition from one chase into another. Decent add-ons across the board. I don't think this killer has the best add-ons in the game, but he might as well have one of the best catalog of add-ons in the game. Some decent brown add-ons, good yellows, good greens, good purples, decent ears. Like, he has good stuff across the board that also keeps him a little bit unpredictable, which is a good thing. In the past, I think two things have changed since the last time we did a tier list and we placed the Wraith in a much lower spot. Number one, I honestly think we underestimated him and the general playstyle that you can engage with the Wraith right now. And number two, the game has evolved in a direction where his strengths are now more relevant than before. So a little while before, especially when medkits were still really good, especially when Circle of Healing made survivors be able to heal on their own relatively fast, Wraith, his tonks were not as valuable. But now we have more difficult self-healing options for survivors. We have some excellent choices for slowdown and auto read and information, and also chase. We have coup de grace for chase. We have some fairly nasty insta-down perks and basic attack perks that work on him because he's a basic attack killer. You can also forget about information and simply use his superior speed to control the map and apply perks like Eruption on gens. One of the nastiest playstyles that works extremely well is to simply focus on a few generators and control them very, very well, to the point where you're bouncing between different targets. And when someone goes down, Eruption kicks in, and then a pop follows, then maybe Painless, and the loop repeats over and over. Even though in the next patch, we're going to see a change to how generators work, and holding 3 gens forever is going to be harder for killer or impossible for killer. It also means that survivors will have a harder time tapping gens. They have to commit to a gen for a little bit longer now if they want to undo the damage of certain perks or kicks. So this does mean that survivors have to put themselves in vulnerable positions for longer. They might need to stay on a gen longer than they want to. So I don't think this change will make Wraith suddenly much, much worse. Now, an obvious thing arises. The major weakness of this killer is that once he uncloaked, he is a basic attack killer with nothing else to him. And theoretically, if you go on really, really bad maps, this would be kind of tough. They drop a pallet, okay, now they drop a pallet, and okay, yeah, sure, you can go around the map, but then every survivor will do the same. That's a problem. But something really good has started to happen that really benefits Wraith. Maps, I can't believe I'm saying this, nature is healing. Maps are getting better. The old cowshed is gone. The newer maps that are getting reworked, with a few exceptions, but for the most part, are becoming more reasonable. They're having less pallets, they're being more open, they have less insane structures, and all of this benefits the Wraith a lot, because with this, he has a lot more to work with. With certain add-ons, he can vault windows really fast, he can break pallets really fast, he can keep the pressure on survivors really, really well, and not having any of these insanely packed pallet-dense maps anymore, or having fewer of them, like Mother's Dwelling, another nightmare, actually begins to really, really shine on him. Needless to say, in indoor maps, he has a natural advantage being a stealth killer. In small maps, he also does pretty well because the best perks on him work well there. So overall, he's a reliable, strong killer that on the hands on someone who's really experienced looks pretty scary, and on anyone else is a fairly strong and reliable pick. So yeah, good stuff, Wraith. Keep it up. We'd love to see it. Next up is Doctor. Now you see that Doctor is really close to Wraith, which we just discussed, but his potential is a lot more all over the place. With Doctor, the main thing to consider is that at lower levels, he's a very overwhelming killer. Beginner to intermediate survivors will really struggle with his skill check, gimmick, perks and add-ons, and even base kit. They will struggle with the lack of information that they have when they're in Manus Tier 3, maybe, and they have a constant red stain on them. That's an add-on thing. Like, all of these things are fairly impactful and difficult for beginners and even intermediates to deal with. And it's also fairly easy to play Doctor at lower levels. Even if you spam your power a little bit, that's okay. Now, at higher levels, the Doctor becomes a lot more demanding. You get to the point where if you spam your power constantly, you're not really getting anywhere. The survivors they grow past all of those gimmicky things. And then Doctor, in those situations, if you're struggling, they have a good map, they have strong perks, they never miss a skill check, or any other gimmick that you bring is failing. For example, Doctor can have a very small terror radius with certain builds, and that can be terrifying. Or, I don't know, maybe if you go to a big map and survivors are communicating perfectly, that can also be a non-factor. So if your gimmick, and Doctor has a lot of them, if your gimmick fails and you're struggling and survivors are playing perfectly, you will see this killer go down and feel painfully average or even sub-average. So that would be a worst-case scenario. However, if you live up to the challenge and you play Doctor well, he is fairly good. He doesn't have any insane mobility, but he finds survivors easily. He can deny strategically their use of items. Say, for example, that you think a survivor has a strong item, maybe a flashlight or something. You could put them into Manus Tier 3. They can't use the flashlight anymore. They can't use the medkit anymore. They can't even heal people on the ground anymore unless they snap out of it. So the Manus Tier 3 can deny important actions at critical times. The other Madnesses also have different effects based on add-ons and situations, but they offer information to you also as well by showing you the Doctor illusions and so on. So there's quite a lot of built-in. And the most important thing is the shock. The shock allows you to make a survivor unable to do any action for a little while. They cannot unhook, which can be mean. They cannot dead hard for a while. They cannot do anything. Even if a survivor is going to a hatch, you could shock them and then close the hatch because they cannot use it. So you can deny a lot of things if a survivor is in front of you. And most importantly, they cannot use things in their environment to loop. So they cannot take a window if they get shocked for 2.5 seconds, and they cannot vault a pallet. And there are a lot of ways to use this power in Shack and in loops to basically deny the loop entirely. And one very nice thing about Doctor that only some high tier killers can do is that he can get downs at the start of the game regardless of the safety of the map and regardless, well, maybe not regardless of the safety of the map, regardless of the amount of resources left. With other killers, such as Wraith, which is fairly strong, don't get me wrong, if a survivor has a very strong pallet, they can drop it. And if they have another strong pallet, they can drop it. Yes, they will run out of pallets eventually, but your first chase, even if you play it perfectly, even if you do everything right, your first chase might take a long time if a survivor is willing to drop every single pallet and abuse every single window. The thing about Doctor, though, is that doesn't always happen. With Doctor, a well-placed shock, even if it takes a little bit longer, a well-placed shock might prevent a survivor from using a pallet entirely. So even if a survivor is ready to drop every pallet, they can't. And this means that you get your first down sometimes faster than many other killers in the roster. That is good. Once you get your first down, that's when the good stuff happens. Doctor can use some perks in very, very mean manners. With, with Deadman Switch, you can shock people from afar or do other shenanigans to block gens from a distance. There's also a really nasty perk that, in my opinion, elevates him significantly and easily buys him a few spots in the tier list, which is Merciless Storm. With Merciless Storm, you get a bunch of skill checks one after another, and if you hit them all, nothing happens and the gen is completed. If you miss one of them, then you lose percentage and the gen gets blocked for 20 seconds. With Doctor, the skill checks are both random in which area they show up, depending on madness, and also can show up in reverse. I think that the average survivor, and even the average good survivor, and even the average top MMR survivor is incapable of hitting these consistently. I've tried it myself, and unless I'm really focused, I don't hit them every single time. The skill checks on Madness 2, especially if there's another skill check perk involved, but even if there's not, are absolutely insanely difficult. And if there's two survivors on a gen, the chances of one of them messing it up is arguably even greater. So this means that if you keep survivors in Madness 1, 2, and you have Merciless Storm, most of the gens that they do will need an extra 20 seconds plus to be completed. This is insane. The last time I abused this on my doctor, we went on a fairly big win streak that we haven't lost since. We haven't really continued it either. But that perk alone was incredibly clutch. And it pairs well with other stuff as well. You can have Deadlock, and now that's another layer of defense. You can have Know It, and you can insta-down and find people in the end game, and that's another layer of difficulty. So he uses a few perks very well. Outside of these perks, he would suffer a little bit. Now, one thing that really helps Doctor is the fact that MFT got nerfed. MFT, by the way, if I didn't mention it earlier, is that one perk that made survivors 3% faster while being injured. Believe it or not, since the Doctor slows himself down slightly while using his power, a survivor being 3% faster was very noticeable, and this hurt the Doctor quite a bit. But that perk is not very popular anymore. It has a different effect now, so it's not something you have to worry about too much. And the current meta benefits him quite a bit. Strong pick with quite a bit of potential, but ultimately also a normal killer. So, you know, if you play your cards right, you spread out, big map, yada yada. He's not a god. He doesn't have the potential of some of the higher tier killers, but who does, frankly? All right, moving on, we arrive at the Trickster. What you need to know about the Trickster is that on release, he was fairly weak. The developers saw that his stats were pretty bad. He wasn't particularly popular. People didn't even like to play against him, but they buffed him and they buffed him and they buffed him, and it wasn't enough until about 3 months ago, they gave him a huge buff in a PTB. He was actually then close to A tier, or maybe A tier entirely. He had some massive number changes, and he would have been really good at doing some things that were honestly not too fun to play against. The community didn't react very well to this, so the developers walked back on some of these changes. They kept some of the other ones, and what we have now is a very strange hybrid. So despite being a range killer with a ranged attack, he now has a normal terror radius of 32 meters and a normal movement speed. So he can be played like a trapper. You can just play him like a normal killer if you want to, or before you need to reload. He's actually fairly good at integrating that as part of his power. You can use your power in times where it's useful and just ignore it and go for normal hits when it's not necessary. Whereas before, you definitely needed to use your power a lot more. But yeah, he benefits from this quite a bit. His power now requires a few more blades to hit than before, but it's still very usable. The add-ons that you're going to run are a little bit different than before, but he still has a couple that are fairly good. And the major change compared to before is that main event happens very quickly. Main event is his ability to throw many knives really quickly without any ammo consumption. And basically, you can do this in almost every chase. And this solidifies him in what he used to be really good at. This killer was very good at, number one, preventing unhooks and camping, but that's getting harder now with the anti-camp feature and the longer, the bigger amount of knives that you need. But mostly what he excels at is at killing you in the open. If you loop him somewhere where the obstacles are low and he has a line of sight of you, you're going to eat knives so damn quickly. You're going to take damage so damn quickly that it's honestly not even a good idea. For that reason, you want to avoid open areas of the map, and you want to take him to places where you can run around tall obstacles or tall walls such as shack, main buildings, and so on. When you do that, and this killer begins to struggle a little bit, but he has his moments of brilliance where maybe going for an unhook becomes impossible and too difficult. Maybe being in the open briefly damages you. Maybe he even manages to get knives here and there enough that you don't really get to use a big loop. His add-ons are also a little bit scary now. He has an add-on that allows him to gather speed as long as he doesn't miss knives, which makes him increasingly hard to avoid. He has add-ons to have a very long, almost continuous main event, which can shed through health states. And if you get unhooked in the wrong spot, you will take a damage and then be almost immediately fully damaged again. So you'll take 2 hits really quickly. And all these things are fairly nasty. He also has an add-on that I expect will be tweaked at some point that increases his throw rate just like that. It's a brown add-on that increases his throw rate, and it's really good and really popular. Why wouldn't you run it? So all of this stuff is fairly okay. Basically, this killer is really, really good at doing one thing and somewhat mediocre at doing others. I cannot think of almost any scenario where this killer outshines others. Many other killers have one map where they are the best, or they have one thing where they are the best. But sadly, Trickster, even in open maps, other killers are just better than him. They have less requirements to reload, less gimmicks with a big terror radius or a lullaby like he has. They have maybe stronger add-ons or are more straightforward. So yeah, ultimately, even though he's fairly strong, he's now sitting in a very awkward phase where he has a bit of an identity crisis, where he's simultaneously encouraged not to use his power too much because he has the high speed, the higher speed, but also is completely unremarkable if you don't master his power and use it to the best of your ability. So you do need to play a little bit mean and mine your structures, and for that reason, he strikes me as a very, very average character right now. Next up is the Knight, which unfortunately at the time of this recording is still disabled due to a nasty bug. I'm going to assume that this bug is obviously fixed and that we play him the way he was before. And unfortunately, the Knight also suffers from a bit of a twin syndrome, where some of his bugs and issues are so prevalent, they've gone so far unfixed, that I almost have to take them as part of the base kit. And it really breaks my heart to say this. Again, a reminder, with any other killer, if there's one small bug that was recently introduced, I typically ignore it, assuming that it will be fixed in a week or in the next patch. But this killer has had a lot of issues that have been completely unaddressed. And for that reason, I think he really, really suffers. This killer, if played correctly, if everything lines up, actually has quite a decently high potential, in my opinion. But it is a shame that so many things hold him back. Now, before we talk about the bugs, and there's a few, let's talk about the positives and some of the drawbacks of this killer. The positives. He is a normal killer that doesn't have any particular downside to him. Normal terror radius, normal launch, normal movement speed, and has a fairly good utility set with his guards. Even if you don't use the guards in chase at all, you can use them to break breakable walls between chases. You can use them to kick gens, which does 5% damage. This is more than what the average killer does, and it's going to be similar to what killers will do in the next patch. So that's going to lose a little bit of value, but still, right now, the guards are good at kicking gens. They're also good at just being placed in an area to guard something sometimes, even though that's not the most common thing you'll do with them. And even in chase, if you only use them to break pallets every now and then, that's still fairly oppressive. And there are some things you can do with guards to just make survivors run out of resources really, really quickly. Now, if you're a little bit more adventurous, there are more things you can do. With particular guards, you have certain tricks that you can do. For example, with the jailer, who has the biggest range, you can put him in a place that is really, really wide to guarantee that survivors cannot go through there undetected. If you ever need to cover a big area, he's your best guy. With the Carnifex, which is the biggest, beefiest one, you can use him in chase. While a pallet is being dropped in front of you, you can use him in chase to instantly break the pallet and pretty much guarantee a hit. That is one of the bread and butter techs that you do with this killer. Wait for a pallet to be dropped. If you guess correctly, you use the Carnifex, instantly break it, get the hit afterwards. Super, super good. With the Assassin, which is the fastest one, you can actually outplay. You can do this with every killer, with every guard, forgive me, but it's particularly good with the Assassin. You can outplay rescues and decisive strikes. If you use the Assassin correctly, you can make it so that he will target a survivor that gets rescued from decisive or a palisade and will get hit almost immediately after. Or be put in a situation where they'll get hit very, very soon after. So you have all these cool things that are awesome. And then you can also send out guards in the distance to harass gens, to maybe get a survivor busy, force them to waste time. The guards aren't like insane or anything. A survivor can run into the flag that they spawn, the little banner, and make them disappear. There's also a few tricks that are really easy to use, and if survivors ever learn to do them consistently, you're really gonna suffer. Survivors that go into a window or a drop pallet will modify the AI of the guard. Normally, a guard would go in a straight line towards the survivor, and if the survivor goes to the side, the guard would go up and follow them. But if a survivor touches with their body a window, the guard will not follow the survivor in a straight line. They'll first go to the window and then follow the survivor. So there's a lot of tricks that you can do to make guards literally never catch you. And even though MFT has been nerfed and survivors don't have a perk now that makes them faster, you can still use these tricks to almost never get hit. In these situations, the guards are just a slight inconvenience. They're almost never going to catch you. If the knight chases you with a guard, that's difficult. And obviously, if you're in a small loop, you cannot stay in that loop because the knight can plant a guard and you're going to get hit. And that leads to some unavoidable hits sometimes. However, once you start to get a bit more wild and bold with your guards and you try to place them from afar, one thing that is going to become extremely obvious is that detecting people with your guards is very difficult. A survivor running away at normal speed, unless you manage to absolutely pinpoint their precise location and snipe the spot ahead of them, they will never get caught by a guard, especially if it's not the jailer. So what you need to do to avoid this is bring a certain map, a certain add-on called the Map of the Realm. It's a brown add-on. It's very accessible, but this add-on it almost feels like a requirement. I am so disappointed that this add-on hasn't been turned into a base kit feature. This killer is so difficult to play in any fun way, because anytime you try to catch a survivor from afar, even if you are 99% of the way there, even if you're very accurate, you're still not getting the hunt to begin. The survivors just outdistance it. So it feels really bad that this killer is so add-on dependent. There's also the issue that some of his green and purple add-ons are a joke. They are a joke. Some of them got buffed since the last tier list, and I'm not even going to talk about them because the buffs are absolutely inconsequential. Some of the buffs actually make the add-ons worse, which is unbelievable to say. But yeah, that means that as this killer, you have maybe 2 or 3 viable add-on combinations. There are some of his potential, though, comes from some of these. There is an add-on that allows you to insta-down, and if you use this in a mean way, you can do some really evil things. Like, for example, camp a survivor. When they come for the rescue, insta-down the rescuer. Like, you can do some nasty things. But all of it is either shaky or difficult or situational and definitely not consistent. And now we talk about the bugs. This killer is just clunky. Even if we acknowledge she's out on dependency and all, he has problems. When you spawn a guard, you can still be stunned by a pallet. They fixed that, presumably, some time ago. It's back in the game. It's been like that for months. There's also a lot of issues where guards will follow a really strange AI. Not even the trick or exploit that I told you about earlier. There's times where your guard will do the strangest bloody things, and you really don't understand what you did wrong. There's all of these things just make playing this killer feel really bad. And also, before the knight was kill switch and temporarily disabled due to a major bug, I'll tell you what it is in case you're curious. Basically, the knight could spawn a guard and then vault a window and then reset his cooldown. So he could spawn like 3 or 4 guards, and it was really stupid. Well, they kill switched him. He's disabled. But even apart from that bug, there was another bug that made the guards not detect loud noise notifications, apparently. So normally when a survivor vaults a window or vaults a pallet or does something loud like that, if a guard is nearby, they will hear it, even through a wall, and react to that. And that was kind of useful because in a lot of maps, you use that to your advantage. You put a guard, you know that the guard doesn't see the survivor, but you know that when you push them, they'll have to vault the window and then the guard starts and so on. Well, that didn't work anymore. And can we expect that to be fixed? I hope so, but yeah, all of these things do make playing the knight a little bit rough. And an otherwise really strong killer becomes much more jarring to play. So yeah, that I have to admit is one of the only 2 killers in the tier list that I generally downgrade just due to their very consistent bugs. Most of the killers, I think I'm very lenient on things like that. But anyway, let's move on to Demogorgon. It is my absolute pleasure to say that this killer is now available again. This killer was available about 2 years ago, and then it disappeared for licensing reasons, and now he's back in the game. So anyone watching this can play him, and that's great. As you can see, compared to other killers, his variability is very low. His bar only goes up a little and down a little. This is kind of a good thing. This killer is never the best at anything. He's a bit of a jack of all trades, but definitely master of none. But he's never also going to be the worst killer ever. If you bring him, he's never going to be the worst or the best. He's going to be pretty average. And honestly, when people ask me, what is the average killer like? Demogorgon always comes to mind. On top of being a normal killer with normal terror radius and blah, 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 and all the normal stats, he has the ability to set out portals, which he can use for mobility. This is not an incredible mobility. Compared to all the killers in the game that can teleport, I think this is probably the weakest teleport, or one of the weakest teleports. But it is still handy and helps in a few big maps or maps that have big obstacles that are not easy to go around. So that's useful. The portals also serve as an information gathering tool and sometimes an area denial tool. With certain add-ons, the portals can reach even further and detect survivors around them even further, and can make the detection more consistent, or can be harder to seal. So you can get information. You can even play a bit of a 3-gen with this killer, which I've tried. You can defend totems, which can be nasty. You can do stuff like that, which can be quite effective. But the portals are not really the real power of Demo. The real power of Demo is his Shred. His Shred has the same properties as a Chainsaw, in that it can break breakable walls and pallets, which is handy. Especially with a certain yellow add-on, which is one of his best. You do that even faster, you recover even quicker. And it also damages survivors. It is a really, really easy to use power. It's a little bit easy to get baited, but it's fairly easy to pick up. And the nice thing about this power is that it has no, almost no wind up. It's really, really fast, so you can react to things happening really quickly. And also, no punishment if you cancel it. With other killers, if you cancel your power, you go into a long cooldown. The survivors now have time. Here, with this killer, you can constantly, and I mean constantly, fake out your power, and you lose basically no speed if you do it right. So he's a killer that can put survivors in lose-lose situations. Survivors have to play really, really smart. They have to drop pallets early sometimes. They have to take chances, try to bait you with a window and then fail, and try to take you to loops that are round. In loops that are round, his power that goes straight is not as useful. But yeah. I would be remiss to forget to mention that he does have a few tricks that are fairly fun. Many maps have invisible walls, but the few maps that don't have invisible walls, you can actually launch yourself with your Shred. So if you're on top of, say, a certain building or a hill, you can launch yourself to gain distance. Always fun. His collision also has some special properties, and you can actually make it glide, huck deck, if you will, some cars and some other obstacles, which gets you hits that are interesting. And his hitbox is also very wide horizontally. This allows you to get hits around pallets and windows that if you saw a really good demo main do, would blow your mind. He also has a little bit of an issue that affects a few other killers, where if you crouch, your hitbox becomes significantly smaller on the sides. It's a little bit hard to explain, but just so you know, if a survivor is not at the center of your screen and you pounce at them, if they're crouching, they will dodge your hit. And this is something that the higher level survivors do and can kinda ruin your chases sometimes. So you need to be a little bit careful. But yeah, overall, I find it hard to add more things to this killer. He's just an average killer. Has a little bit of mobility, a little bit of detection, a little bit of chase, a little bit of pallet breaking utility, and that's it. He has the same weaknesses as your average killer. Big maps are going to be a problem. Good survivors with good perks are going to be a problem. Really pallet dense maps are going to be a problem. If you get baited into missing your power, you're going to have a problem. But these are just the normal things, and honestly, he's a really good baseline for what every killer should be. So yeah, good stuff. Well done, Demogorgon, and welcome back. Now, Nemesis. Can we just... Like, Nemesis is really, really close to Demogorgon, and as you can see, based on the potential, actually much stronger at his best, but also much weaker at his worst. So Nemesis, despite being close in average to Demogorgon in terms of how strong they are, their potential swivels and swings up and down much more significantly. In other words, they are very inconsistent. The first thing that really defines what Nemesis is and what really tells you all about his inconsistency is his zombies. At the start of the game, after a few seconds, zombies will spawn in the map. There's always 2 of them, and they roam around the map, and they follow a simple pattern of just walking around places. They react to some noises and some notifications, and when they detect a survivor in their little cone of detection, or they hear it or whatever, they build up their arms and they start walking towards them and basically harass them a little bit. Zombies can be disabled by flashlights or flashbangs or other flashy things, or killed by stunning with pallet or head-on. This makes them unable to move for a while, or they respawn after a while, and Nemesis, at any point pretty much throughout the game, can look around to see zombies at any range and know what they're doing, more or less. So that's a good thing. Like that's not bad. Having this isn't bad. But the problem is that zombies can go from 0 to hero really, really quickly. On the worst case scenario, zombies go in a large map, they patrol the areas that no survivor is in, they even get stuck in places. I do think they've honestly improved their pathing. I've played a lot of Nemesis. I've seen less instances of zombies getting stuck, so congratulations, behavior. It happens less, but it still happens. Every now and then, a zombie's gonna get stuck in one spot, and if they get stuck on one spot, they don't disappear and reappear elsewhere. They don't respawn. They just stay there until you kill them or a survivor manages to get them unstuck, which might never happen. So zombies are inconsistent if that happens a lot. On the other hand, every now and then you will have a miracle where a zombie just, or maybe 2 zombies manage to harass the most important gen in the game and win you the game. And it's really difficult sometimes to figure out how much your zombies help. My best impression after playing and trying to pay as much attention to really figure out how good they are is that on average, zombies are okay. They're fine, especially against lower rated and lesser experienced opponents. They are so good because they don't always manage them very efficiently, and they don't know all the tricks that you can do to get them to lose you. There are a few tricks you can do that are really unpopular, not really known by the survivors. So against lesser experienced opponents, they're definitely very good. Against more experienced opponents, every game they'll do 1 or 2 good things for you, and that's all you can expect from them. But as I said, highly inconsistent. Then you have the power that you actually control, which is your tentacle. Your tentacle allows you to hit people, and it has a really interesting hitbox that works vertically and goes from top to bottom. So it's almost as if you have a rope and you throw it up and it falls down. Think of it like a fishing rod or something. You can break pallets with this power, but only when you get to tier 2. And doing this is extremely important. And here is another source of his inconsistency. If a Nemesis finds a group of survivors at the start and hits 1 survivor, and then hits another survivor with a tentacle, that is 2 survivor hits, that's 6 points, that's tier 2. In that game, Nemesis becomes really, really powerful almost immediately, because now the next chase, he can already break pallets, and dropping a pallet on him, almost, like, you still have to do it, but it almost feels like a waste of time, because he shreds through them faster than almost any other killer in the game. I think, yeah, now that Compound 33 is getting nerfed, I think he's the best pallet breaker in the game. I think bar none. So he's really, really good at getting rid of pallets, and even breakable walls, he can barge through them with his tentacle as well, which is really good. So at that point, Nemesis becomes much more threatening. However, think about the opposite scenario. What if survivors split up? Then you hit a survivor, and now you hit a survivor again, and now you hit a survivor again 3 times with your tentacle, and you're still not in tier 2. So it's extremely, extremely important for you to get to tier 2, and sometimes, even if you do everything right, you might just have nothing. For example, if you chase a survivor A, and you hit them with your tentacle, that's 3 out of 6 points. And then you go to survivor B, and survivor B gets hit by a zombie. That doesn't give you points anymore. You only get 1. So now you will have to hit that survivor, and then you'll have to hit the zombie, and then you'll have to hit another zombie. Like, it's gonna take you forever. And during that time, you cannot break pallets, so survivors can just breed up certain pallets, and you're very, very inconsistent. So yeah, that's tough. Now, let's go back to the greener pastures. Let's go to a good scenario. In most games, if you play it right, even though it can take a while, in most games, you will get to tier 2 relatively often, or maybe you'll take a while, but you'll have a lot of perks to slow down the game, so it's not too big of a deal. And then eventually you get to tier 2, maybe you get to tier 3, where your tentacle reaches further and you have a faster speed holding it. And then Nemesis becomes quite okay. He's incredibly difficult to shake off from up close. It's a bit like Pyramid Head, but obviously much more oppressive. When you're up close, you're going to get hit no matter what. You take the window, hit. Take the pallet, hit. Drop the pallet, hit. Unless you really trick him somehow, which is possible, but unless you really trick him, you're most likely getting hit. The catch is that he has to hit you 3 times. The first one infects you, and once you're infected, the next one injures, the next one downs. So it is a killer that needs to get 3 hits, that is highly inconsistent, that doesn't have any particular mobility, whose zombies only cover a part of the map and suffer from bigger maps. So you're probably, after I'm saying all this, you're probably starting to see, if you didn't know already, that this killer sometimes feels incredible and sometimes just sucks. If you manage to get to tier 2 soon, if you manage to get some infections, if you manage to use your tentacle and chase in a very brutal fashion and survivors have no way to hold you back, then you're gonna tunnel one person out, the zombies are gonna make the last few gens really difficult, your perks are gonna make the game really difficult, and then he's amazing and fun. And if you struggle at the start because your zombies do nothing, because survivors deny you the tier 2, because hitting people 3 times is extremely punishing, and then at the end maybe they have an exhaustion perk, so you have to catch up to them, 4 times essentially. That thing feels brutal, and then Nemesis, I think, drops down very significantly when that happens. But on average, he's pretty okay. He's pretty good. I have fun. He's still one of my favorite killers despite all these negative things that I said, so go figure. Next up is Baba, aka the Cannibal. The Cannibal is an interesting killer. I almost think of him as 2 different killers. If you use his Chenso, not at all, or in a very simple way, only using it when a survivor is very clearly in the open, he's okay-ish. He can break pallets, like anyone else with a Chenso. He can camp at the end game. You can't camp nearly as effectively as before. This killer used to have an amazing feature, which was basically the ability to convince survivors that unhooking is impossible, because it basically was. If you stay next to the hook, you can just sit there, and unhooking is essentially impossible. Like, it's not just impossible, it is actively detrimental, because they'll go down and things will be bad. But now we have an anti-camping measure that works throughout the game until the end of the game. And if you do that, the survivor will unhook themselves. And survivors that unhook themselves now have a guaranteed protection against the Chenso. It used to be that if a survivor was unhooked or saved themselves somehow from the hook, you could double tap them with the Chenso. You could go choo, and hit them really quickly. That doesn't happen anymore. A recently unhooked survivor cannot be double tapped by a Chenso. They have like an immunity where the first hit will connect, but the second one will take a while. There's not a lot of ways to effectively rig this, so you will not be camping with this killer in the early game. That shouldn't work. Even if survivors have no perks, that shouldn't work. In the end game, though, he's very good at camping. If you've already killed some survivors and you want to defend one final kill, there is nothing they can do about it. You will always walk home with 1 or 2 kills if you want to play mean. But that doesn't mean you're going to win. How do you win with this killer? With this killer, at the higher levels, you need to play him not just in the simple way. You need to actually use his Chenso. His Chenso, when used correctly, is almost a mobility tool. You can use it from very far distances to sweep in such a way that you will outrun a survivor. And even in some loops, you can use like he gets faster as he goes. You can use the increased speed to force 50-50s and get hits, and sometimes get hits and pallets at the same time. Now, there is a catch for this, though. You need add-ons. His Chenso with base kit is very, very mild. It's not really suited to do all of these things that I just described. If you want to use his Chenso at the higher level, you will need to bring Bamboozle, which immediately makes you a bit more predictable. If you go to a map that has a lot of windows, your power is useless. They are so easy. It's so easy to circumvent your Chenso by just alternating a window or two. So Bamboozle is an absolute must to block the windows and then force pallet drops. And then you also need to bring presumably the 2 best add-ons in the game, but for him. But there's maybe a few combinations, but you're probably going to be running either engravings, the marks, or the chilies, or a combination of both, probably a combination of both. So you're going to be running these add-ons, and that is a little bit sad. Similar to Knight, the best Bubbas, they're strong, but they're predictable. You're never gonna be like, oh my god, it's an iridescent this. Nah, it's always gonna be those two almost every time, which is a little bit sad. If you do commit to getting good with Bubba, you can definitely have a lot of fun in Chase and be really, really scary, and also be fairly good in some scenarios. If a survivor makes a mistake of grouping up and getting hit in a group, that's obviously GG for them. If they go down in an area, you're fairly good at defending it. The sad part is, though, that playing defensive as a playstyle is being less and less desirable and more punished for killer. So if you have a 3-gen and you hook someone in the middle, you used to be able to camp that. And that was actually the correct play. I would have done it. I wouldn't have not complained if that was done to me. If you have a hook in the middle of 3-gens, where would you want to leave, right? Just sit there. What are they going to do? But now you can't do that anymore for extended periods of time because, yeah, even if it's strategic and only occasional, camping does get punished. And that ultimately brings the Cannibal down a tiny little bit. But there's still a little bit of hope if you want to play him at a high level. He's, he can. I've seen some very short chases from Cannibals that are really, really good. So please don't be discouraged. Maybe now that I see it, maybe the range of variability that I gave him could be a bit higher. Maybe he could dip into the B+ tier. Maybe not. Your call. Next up is the Dredge. Now, let me tell you, the Dredge is one of the killers that I've downgraded the most since the last tier list. He's gone down the most. And it's not because I don't like him. He's actually one of my favorite killers, and I really, really liked him. But I've also noticed that he is madly inconsistent. Sometimes even bordering on being one of the worst killers in the game based on a few things. Now, let me tell you what things the Dredge is really, really good at, because those are fairly obvious. Number one, he has a passive ability that makes the screen very, very dark and obscures vision. For beginners, this is an absolute nightmare. Beginners already have a hard time finding their north and knowing where they are on a map, especially if they don't have bursts to help themselves, and making things dark disorients them tremendously. There's also a lot of people that are not necessarily beginners that play on a TV, or maybe they play on a lit room, maybe during sunlight hours. And if you do not play on PC with some filters and a nice bright screen, you don't see stuff. I once played on a laptop on someone else's computer against a Dredge in a map that is not even the darkest, and I swear I could not see a thing. It was one of the worst experiences I've had with this game. So this killer, already by the mere fact of existing with his Nightfall ability, makes some players have a hard time. Obviously, during Nightfall, you also get the benefits of his faster teleport and so on. But that's a given. Now, on top of this, this killer does have a little bit of he dips his paw in a few different ponds. He has a bit of mobility with his teleport. It's not an insane mobility, even though it's really, really fast. Outside of Nightfall, it gets slowed down by the lockers. It gets slowed down by the fact that some areas don't have really good lockers, and this is where much of his inconsistency lies in. A lot of maps have awful locker placement. If you play, for example, on RPD, especially on the, which one would you say? On both variants, really. There are maybe 2 to 3 very important generators that you have no way of defending. The one that is out in the little path, you just have no way to defend that. And you might be like, well, it's true, maybe you can't spawn next to the generator, but can you just walk there? Not really, because survivors can just loop you around and they know that you're coming. One of the major downsides of this killer, I'm sorry that we dip into the downside so quickly, is his unique noise. He almost has a lullaby. It's not a lullaby. It doesn't get picked up by the game as a lullaby. But this killer emanates a constant whooshing sound that is unlike anything else in the game. Unlike anything else in the game. There are other killers that are really quiet. There are other killers that are maybe a little bit noisy from now and then because they do footsteps or they do grunts. And then there's the Dredge. The Dredge has this little sound that follows him everywhere. From up close, it's extremely audible and directional. This means that any mind game will automatically fail. Any mind game at all, unless survivors are really, really pressed and overwhelmed by other things, will not work because survivors can literally hear you. If you come from the right, they hear you on the right and go to the left, and the other way around. This is awful. And it even is audible from very far away. It starts to be audible at around 25 meters. Now, the average survivor working in a gen, doing some stuff, talking to their friends on Discord, blah, 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 they don't hear you at 25 meters, but they do start to hear you at 15 to 20, and that's plenty. That's plenty to run away. This sound never goes away, even if you're undetectable, even if it's nightfall, even if you, I don't know, take out your headset. Doesn't matter. You will still hear it. It's so loud. And yeah, as I mentioned, it makes your normal chases much harder. Outside of nightfall, it makes bad areas without lockers impossible to approach, because if you go there, they'll have a huge head start that you're coming no matter what. And this makes him really, really hard to play. Now, he does have another ability that I didn't talk about yet called the Remnant. With the Remnant, you leave a little shadow behind, and you can actually teleport to this ability, to this Remnant, forgive me, to go back to the place where you were in, and you can use this in Chase. Now, compared to other Chase abilities, this is one of the weaker abilities in the game. If used correctly, it is fairly good and can corner survivors that are already in a bad spot. It can make a hit that would be a bit difficult guaranteed, which is awesome, and I love it. It's my favorite part of him. But when survivors had speed boost perks, when survivors back in the day especially had MFT and they were 3% faster, the fact that you slow yourself down so much when you use it is super, super punishing. And at the end of the day, even some of the guaranteed hits that you get with this killer still take a lot of time. There are other killers like Chucky who have a guaranteed hit in 3 seconds. You drop a pallet, he goes underneath, he hits you. With this killer, even if you do it well, like sometimes I will be streaming this game and chatting, and I'll be like, okay guys, I'm gonna get a hit. I put the Remnant, I walk around, I force Zuar into a direction, I teleport at the perfect time, I hit them. That still takes me 10 seconds to pull off. It's really, really slow pace. Now, if one thing that is definitely good for him, survivors now have lesser opportunities to heal compared to before, which is kind of good. They don't have circular healing. Medkits are a bit weaker. Keeping people injured is very important because it makes the nightfall flow faster, and that's always a good thing. But the new perks survivors are running are not that much better. Sprint Burst is brutal against him. Adrenaline is brutal against him. Almost everything that is popular is really, really good against this killer. There's really no going wrong with him. He doesn't counter anything in particular. That being said, he does have some decent add-ons, and especially at the purple rarity, you have a few add-ons that are fairly mean and can kind of combo with certain builds into things that are fairly usable. You will also notice that he's potentially rather high. That's true. There are some maps where this killer is an absolute monster. On top of that, you might also find some situations where this killer is an absolute monster, other than just beginners, as I mentioned earlier. In some situations, with some blindness add-on or some blindness perk or an anti-healing against a team that is really, really hard pressed to get the heals going, you can be so brutal. I have games with this killer where I feel so powerful, especially if you go mid-witch, for example. Lockers everywhere, loops, all of the loops are good for your power pretty much, you know, like everything falls into place. And then you go on a map where nothing works, where everything falls apart, and that variability I think hurts him a little. That ultimately I think holds him back a little bit. And if you didn't know about the sound that he makes, I think that's something that you really, really need to consider when placing him. Believe it or not, even though I think this killer is fairly strong, it's one of the killers that I most consistently, despite doing my best to learn him, it's one of the killers that I most consistently find myself struggling with. Just because maybe the map wasn't good enough. So yeah, when you consider the inconsistencies, I would definitely place him down here. Much to my dismay, I really wish this killer was a bit more well-rounded. And less, I didn't mention this, but even though he does have good add-ons, he's also add-on dependent to a fault. He wishes he could run 3 add-ons. If you run the add-on to get your power back faster, that feels really good. If you run the add-on to not spend 5 years coming out of a locker, the Hari calendar, that feels really good. If you have the add-on to teleport faster out of Nightfall, that feels really good. If you have the add-on to increase the duration of Nightfall or make it happen sooner, the Malthinker's Skull and the Broken Doll, those feel really good too. But guess what? You're only going to get 2 of those. You're not a special kid. You don't have 3 or 4 add-ons to choose from. You don't have that privilege. You're not special. You are the same as every other killer. You have 2 add-ons. And those 2 add-ons that you pick will dictate what your weakness is. If you have the faster teleport and the faster nightfall, you don't have the breaking out of lockers faster, which can sometimes really, really hurt you, and so on and so forth. So yeah, if this killer could equip 4 add-ons, then definitely I would put him up in B tier for sure. That would be awesome. But, you know, we can pray. Next up is Ghostface. Now, Ghostface, sometimes he's a really popular killer, as far as I understand it. And he's also the type of killer that performs just fine or even really well in your average lobby or lower experience lobby. So I do think he's a killer that people maybe overrate slightly. I don't know. He also got an assortment of buffs in the last few months that are honestly amazing. He's as of some time ago, his brown add-ons are awesome. Some of his Eries and purples are decent. They've also nerfed some of the perks that hurt him a little bit, and they also made his cooldown just 20 seconds default. That's awesome. You had to use several add-ons before to get that, and now it's just base kit. All of that is great. But at the end of the day, he's an average killer with an average movement speed. He has the ability to insta-down, but it does get mitigated by the fact that teamwork and open maps sometimes make this difficult. And ultimately, I don't think he has any extremely nuclear options in terms of add-ons that really, really boost him. I would say, though, if we allow him everything, if we allow him to go to a map that he chooses with a build tailored to that map, he can have honestly a field day. Like Ghostface, for example, is very popular in competitive, and in competitive settings, playing him in something like Larry's, he is unbelievably difficult to play against, and even coordinated teams struggle to deal with a killer that can lose the terror radius, that can insta down, that can make teamwork difficult, that can interrupt healing, that can kick gens that then explode with eruption, and so on. But obviously, your main enemy in outside of a competitive setting is the map offering. If you bring yourself a map offering and the survivors bring you to an open map, now what are you doing now? Maybe your build doesn't work so well. But overall, he's a well-rounded character. He's okay. At lower levels, he's completely fine. At medium, intermediate levels, he's completely fine. Maybe you stalk a bit less and just focus more on the hit and run stealth aspect of him. At the higher levels, you definitely want to lean more. Literally, you want to lean more and use your stalking more frequently to either fully stalk people and down them as quickly as possible, or better yet, 99 them, leave them for later, catch them later. Maybe if you do this without their prior knowledge, that can really help. Many situations with Ghostface, many of the games that you'll win with Ghostface at the higher level, when you learn how to do this consistently, basically go like this. You find a survivor that doesn't know you're there, you stalk them to 99%, later that survivor goes for a rescue or tries to take a hit, and then you go, whoop, and they go down. And they didn't know that they were going to go down. At the higher level, survivors do have their counterplay to this. They can take a hit when you're carrying someone else and unable to mark them, and that will remove the mark. They can also use the very, very popular perks that are out right now to honestly mitigate your insta down. With Sprint Burst, you're never really safe. Someone could still get a bit of distance on you. With Further People Buckle Up, someone about to go down has a bit of a timer. Like they know, like the teammates know that they're about to go down, so they might come in to revive them afterwards. And now you've used your time and resources to insta down someone that gets picked up from the ground. So all of these things hurt Ghostface a little bit. You could argue also that the fact that the maps are getting better and we have less incredibly palette dense maps and incredibly large maps, that has made the game a bit better for Ghostface, but it also has done the same for other killers above him. So yeah, on the higher spectrum of add-ons, we have add-ons to reveal autos of other survivors. This would have been really, really useful and powerful. I mean, this already existed, but this add-on used to be arguably a little bit more meaningful if you could get it. It was a bit less powerful than it is now, but now we have an ecosystem of survivors that often run off the record and often run distortion. So your auto reading add-ons, the couple of them, are a little bit less valuable. The other ones are still fine, and the fact that this killer has excellent brown add-ons is honestly a blessing, especially for newer players. But yeah, at the higher level, another thing that you'll see very often is gimmicks to make the M1 a bit faster. Some of the high-level Ghostface players really swear by perks like Play Your Food, and they'll take a very tactical approach where they'll stalk a bunch of people, get stacks from the obsession, and make it a little bit easier to catch someone no matter what due to the speed that they gain from play with your foot. So that's something that you'll see, but ultimately I do think Ghostface he's just basically limited by the fact that for the most part he doesn't have any insane chase, any insane mobility, any insane anything. You rely on stealth and a little bit of scheming, and that is hardly the most oppressive thing in the killer cast, but definitely not bad. Now, oh man, Hillbilly. Now, Hillbilly, if you didn't catch it earlier in the video, in the PTB is quite the beast. But now we're going to talk about his current state in the 7.4 update, not in the 7.5. In his current state, Billy is a bit of a sad mess. He doesn't have the ability to overdrive like he'll have soon. Using your chainsaw repeatedly, using it for mobility and then chaining it into a chase is actually a bad thing because it overheats and actually goes into cooldown for about 20 seconds. This means that you actually need to be a little bit picky with your overheat, and the whole idea of going around the map and switching back and forth and maybe kicking a gen, going back to hook, all of this doesn't work with the same flow that the new Billy has. So that's something you cannot do. For the most part, you want to use your mobility a little bit and then let it rest for a while if you have to, and then use it in chase. But using it in chase is just so much harder. Even if you land next to a survivor that is right next to you, you have a bigger cooldown than the new Billy does. You don't have any downs to lessen that cooldown, which the new Billy does. One of them might be bugged, but that's beyond the point. So yeah, you're a killer you're a basic killer that can do normal stuff, but you want to use your chainsaw in chase when possible to get that insta down. And doing this is incredibly difficult. Around pallets, if survivors play perfectly, you will be eating pallets rather than downs. And around windows, you will be eating dust. You'll be eating nothing. You will most likely bring Bamboozle. Watch any good Billy player. Bamboozle will be a permanent pick in their build so that they are able to play around windows. Even though some maps just don't have that many windows. If you go to the game, for example, there's not that many windows. You don't need Bamboozle in the game, but you don't know that you're going to the game, so you have to bring Bamboozle just in case you don't. So it is a little bit sad that you're also a little bit predictable. Very similar situation with the Cannibal that we talked about earlier. Now, his chainsaw with the current Billy has a problem. It is not good enough for the high level play. Much like the Cannibal, the average Hillbilly player at the higher level uses two add-ons, sometimes together, sometimes separately, to make the chainsaw actually fearsome. The first one is the engravings. With the engravings, you have a bit of a downside of charging longer, but your chainsaw is actually fast enough to curve and hit people around certain obstacles in a way that they can't really always react and dodge out of. Similar to Demogorgon, by the way, this is still the case for new Billy. Survivors crouching have a much smaller hitbox. So one staple of Survivor gameplay that you'll see against Billies at the higher levels is Survivors crouching to dodge a chainsaw slightly. That still works with the new Billy. But against the old Billy, it's even better because he's a bit slower with his chainsaw sprint. So yeah, you will need the engravings to competitively catch to that, and they do make the game a bit harder. And you also might need the low pro chains. The low pro chains are a blessing for the current Billy. They allow him to break a pallet, recover a bit faster if he doesn't do anything else, and maybe even hit a survivor afterwards. The hit on the survivor doesn't insta down, but it's still damage. That means that if a survivor wants to drop a pallet right in front of you and you have your chainsaw ready, you can mow them down with the chainsaw, and that's a good thing because that means they have to not throw it down mindlessly, and now you can make a mind game happen and you can get a down or a hit or whatever. So those are the things that keep Billy alive, and they're the things that bring his potential up a little bit. If you play him normally, he's just really tough, incredibly unforgiving. If you bump into an obstacle, unlike the new Billy, you have an insanely long cooldown where you stand completely still. Survivors make a lot of distance. Most loops in the game allow survivors to reliably deny your chainsaw for at least a little while, and even then you will need Bamboozle, and even then you will be breaking pallets. Not to mention that indoor maps have a lot of obstacles and they're tough for you. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that the new Billy will have lesser collision around him. That means that he can actually gently bump into, say, a little tree or an obstacle and not bump into them. This is not the case for the current Billy. The current 7.4 Billy has very unforgiving hitboxes, and many maps have horrible little branches and obstacles that get stuck on your chainsaw. They don't get stuck on survivors, which is absolutely infuriating. So that means that a survivor can hug a loop around, for example, Area of Crows. And if you do the same thing with your chainsaw, you will hit an invisible branch. And it is absolutely infuriating. So he's unforgiving. He is difficult. You have to both... his mechanical skill required is actually really high as well. You need to be able to time your chainsaw well and do the flick and do all these things. And even when you do all of that correctly, if a survivor guesses what you're going to do, they can sometimes just go to the side, crouch a little bit, they're fine. With the current Billy, as I mentioned earlier, if a survivor dodges your chainsaw, they make quite a bit of distance and can easily get to the next pallet or window if they're close. With the new Billy, your cooldown is a lot shorter. So after you miss a chainsaw like that, you can get a hit maybe. And that all of that makes a lot of difference. But yeah, new Billy, pretty good. Old Billy, a little bit on the low side. And we didn't even talk about the fact that when you go into overdrive, you have a chainsaw that is faster and stronger as well, which has its own ups and downs, but for the most part is a really good thing. None of that available for Billy. I also didn't talk about his other add-ons because they are frankly either forgettable or straight up useless. New Billy, make no mistake, has maybe 4 or 5, at least 5 add-ons in my view that are useless. But the other ones are okay, and his base kit is fine. Current Billy's base kit is lacking, and outside of those couple add-ons that I mentioned, you have one of the worst catalogs of add-ons in the entire game. Pathetically bad. So yeah, unfortunately that doesn't help, and it's one of the reasons why he's stuck down here. Next up is Pig. And I made a prediction some time ago, if you care about that Pig would get nerfed. And she hasn't been nerfed, despite the memes. But I still think that this killer is actually probably really strong in the stats of the game. She has something that almost no other killer has, that at the lower and intermediate levels is actually really, really good. And that's why in previous times when the developers have shared data, we see the Pig very high the statistics. It's the fact that she has a built-in slowdown. She has an ability to set a little trap on the survivor head, and this will slow down the game because the survivors have to remove it. If they don't remove it, potentially they could die. Most of the time they don't die, but they have to remove it still. Now, something really good happened to the Pig a few months ago. The luck on this power changed. In the past, it was complete random luck how long a survivor needed to remove it. So they could take anywhere from 1 to 4 searches. If you were extremely unlucky as a survivor, it would take you 4 searches. If you were very lucky, it could take you 1. And this happened to everyone. So in an ideal game, each survivor would have 4 searches. So that would be 4 times 4, 16 searches, right? And in a horrible game, as a Pig, you would have 4 survivors all get their trap off first try. Only 4 searches. That would be terrible. You would lose the game really, really badly. This made her unbelievably unpredictable, and it was honestly a really bad thing. But now that doesn't happen anymore. The Pig has a fixed RNG. Survivors now have a random amount of searches, but they all amount to the same total. That means that on average, each survivor will be doing 3 searches. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but on average, it will always be 3. And that is awesome. That means that as long as you're getting downs, the game will be slowed down to some degree. As I said, because beginners are a little bit clumsy and they don't necessarily run you for a very long time at the start, and they're very chaotic, this is going to really, really eat at them. But let's leave that behind. Let's go to the higher MMR. Let's say that you've been playing this killer for a while, you're doing really well, winning most of your games. When you go against better opponents, what's going to happen with the Pig? Well, the first thing you're going to notice is that your chases are going to be a lot harder. The Pig has a stealth power that is possibly the weakest stealth power in the game. She can crouch and go around the map, but she's unbelievably slow, doesn't see very well, and doesn't have any ability to find people with her power. So your stealth has to be used very, very sparingly unless you have a certain add-on or a certain perk that lets you know where people are ahead of time. So you cannot just use your stealth around the map. That's not a huge part of her power for the most part. And out of this stealth mode, she can also perform an ambush. Now, this ambush is somewhat similar to Chucky, which we talked about earlier, but it's basically like 5 times worse. Whereas Chucky has a fast charge and he moves incredibly fast, this girl takes a long time to crouch down, a long time to charge it, and she's not super fast with it. And she cannot go under pallets or over windows with it like Chucky can. So for that reason, this power to chase is very, very weak. Every now and then there will be a part of the map where a somewhat tricky hit becomes a guaranteed hit thanks to her ambush, but these are rare. And even then, survivors could use things like dead harding into your ambush and other little tricks to make it harder for you to land them. So at the higher levels, the first thing that you'll notice is that her chase power is just weak. It's really, really weak. And that bottlenecks everything else. If you go on a map that is a little bit difficult and survivors give you good chases, everyone is solid, you can get it down, 5 gens above, that's where her low potential comes. You see how her potential extends all the way to the bottom of the tier list pretty much? Yeah, she could honestly be one of the worst killers in the game in that scenario. Even then, she probably wouldn't be the worst, because if you manage to place a trap on one survivor and then just tunnel that survivor, they're probably dead. Unless they get hatched somehow, which would be really miraculous, a survivor in the endgame with an active trap is basically screwed no matter what. And if you play really, really dirty, and there's some builds to do that, you can definitely play every game and get 2 kills almost no matter what. But obviously that's not winning the game. That's not really a point to her favor. We want to go beyond that. What can we do other than hope that we get really good chases? That's where her potential spikes up. What makes the pig actually fairly good? Why did I think that she would get nerfed, even though she hasn't? It's her add-ons. She has a few add-ons that make the searches significantly longer, or extend how long they need to be done, or they reduce the timer that survivors have before they die to them. These add-ons have been tweaked, but they're still a bit overtuned in my opinion. You can very reliably run these add-ons and see one person die pretty much every other game. Like, I say every other game as a conservative measure, but I do think it could happen even more frequently than that. With the right add-ons, now that we know that the RNG is somewhat fixed and that there's not a... Like, here's the thing, right? In the past, her add-ons were stronger, but survivors could get lucky and get one search. Now, at least one survivor is going to have to do 3 or 4 searches. And with certain add-ons, especially if you send yourself to a certain map, or if you get lucky with a map, survivors don't have physical time to do it. If a survivor comes out of a hook and they have an active trap and they have to do 4 searches, even if you don't interrupt them on a map like RPD, they barely have any time to do that. If at any point they stop to heal, or if you interrupt them, or if they're a bit clumsy and they miss a skill, they are dead. They are dead. They are dead. And the best part is that you're not even chasing them. You're just chasing another survivor and pressuring other gens. So yeah, the ability to sometimes kill people passively after you hook them once is unbelievably strong. And the counterplay to this is a bit difficult. The average team, and definitely the average solo players, are not going to be 99ing gens to try to have a trap not trigger. The best they can do is notice that the add-on is in play and try to play seriously around it. I also didn't mention Ultimate Weapon and Face the Darkness and a few other perks that can make this even more difficult. If survivors scream and get interrupted, guess what? Their trap progress resets. I'm not even taking this into account too much, but you also could run that if you are particularly evil, and it's bad. It's bad. So yeah, killer with a somewhat subpar chase power, with a decent game delay that can turn into lethal game delay with certain add-ons, and especially on certain maps. Not too bad, but also not terribly exciting, if I'm completely honest. Next up, we have the Clown. The Clown is the personification of an average killer in terms of weaknesses. He has all the problems of an average killer with no mobility. Because he has to reload his bottles, his mobility is actually lower than average, right? So yeah, big maps are going to be tough. Survivor splitting up are going to be tough. And he just doesn't have the potential to reach the levels of oppression that other killers get easily, even with very little perks or add-ons. That being said, so in that regard, yeah, you could be one of the worst killers in the game. That being said, he does have one thing going for him that is fairly nice, and that is the fact that he has an excellent chase power that, if played correctly, almost always gets something out of survivors. That something might be an insta-hit. That something might be a hit after a few seconds. That something might be a pallet drop and then a hit. Sometimes it will just be a pallet that you have to break, and that's completely fine, but you're still getting something. And the fact that we have now less and less maps that are super big and super pallet dense helps him not be super, super terrible. That being said, he has been nerfed in some ways, directly and indirectly. He used to have an add-on that was really, really nasty that allowed him to insta-down survivors relatively for free and had no downside. That add-on has been nerfed and is now it's now behind a hefty downside of removing bottles. So that, I'm not even sure is even the best add-on. I don't think it is the best add-on. It is maybe good in some cases, but his nastiest add-on has been nerfed. Now, for the gentleman clown, the clown that is cultured, that really wants to learn the game and play him at the highest level, the best add-on for him is probably the auto-reading cigar box. The cigar box is an add-on that allowed him to very reliably go around the map and find people around him, and also helping chase. And seeing autos of survivors has a lot of benefits. I don't need to list them all down. You guys know that. But yeah, this add-on was really, really good. It's still really good, but keep in mind that in the current state of the game, a lot of people run off the record, which hides your aura after an unhook. And for some reason, a lot of people are running distortion, which will not just hide your aura, it will also hide your scratch marks when that happens. So even his best add-on now has a bit of a downside and a bit of a risk. And everything else is still okay, but this is a one-trick pony. Clown has 2 bottles. The purple bottles are to slow down survivors, and the yellow bottles are mostly complementary to make the purple bottles even better. As I mentioned earlier, in many situations, a survivor will drop a pallet, and you might not need to break it. If it's not a super, super safe pallet, like say Shack, you can very often use bottles, either one purple or a combination of both, to get a hit around most pallets, even without having to break them, which is awesome, and not a lot of killers can do. This is similar to Doctor, where the clown sometimes can get hits even if there's a lot of pallets left. But the problem, this takes time. Even if you get the hit fast, you eventually have to reload. You eventually have to slow yourself down. Unlike other killers, once you hook a survivor, you don't have an immediate way to zoom across the map and deliver a pop and check on gens being done across the map. So that lack of mobility eventually bites you in the butt. And when survivors split up, you just, even though you are a good 1v1 killer, you find the 1v4 a bit tough. Not to mention that some of the better perks in the game right now are fairly strong against a killer with low mobility, and a killer that doesn't have any insane ability to hit multiple times. So things like For the People Buckle Up, Sprint Burst, Adrenaline, all of these things hurt quite a bit. So even the best clown will often find themselves in games that are honestly very, very difficult to win. Next up is Legion. Now, Legion is going down the list a little bit, I think, based on our latest tier list, but not necessarily because they've gotten a lot worse. It's just every other killer has maybe gotten something in return, and this killer is becoming a little bit more predictable by the day. Now, one big thing that happens in the last tier list is the nerf to Made for This. Made for This was a very ubiquitous perk that nearly every other survivor run, especially at the higher levels. I think the second most popular perk for a while, and it makes people that were injured faster. That's it. That was huge against Legion, because Legion is all about easily getting one person injured and multiple people injured, but then struggling to make the down happen because you don't have a lot of power afterwards. He's by no means the worst killer in the game, and he can climb up quite a little bit, but he's ultimately very predictable. When me and my friends, I'll give you a bit of an anecdote in case it matters to you. When me and my friends played in a challenge as a survivor and we had to stay alive as much as possible, every time we saw a Legion, we sided with the biggest relief, because this killer is just ultimately pretty predictable. If survivors split up, you know that they don't have any insanely quick way of getting a down. They might have some add-ons to find survivors. They might have some add-ons to guarantee the hit. They might even have the iridescent add-on to break a pallet relatively fast. But even all of this is ultimately still manageable and predictable from the survivor side. Now, I'll tell you what makes Legion quite popular and honestly quite good at the lower or intermediate levels. He's a very straightforward killer, very easy to pick up. Survivors grouping up together and being clumsy lead to multiple hits. It's also not uncommon, even at higher levels, for survivors to eventually mess up and give you 3 hits. And then if you hit the 4th guy, that's it. Next hit will down anyone. So the 5th hit is really, really nasty, and against those lobbies, it will get you a nice advantage. There's even some add-ons that allow him to go for a long time to make this 5th hit harder to avoid. However, once you get to the higher levels, well, two problems become apparent. The lack of chase power outside of his frenzy means that once survivors are injured, sometimes they're very comfortable being injured. They bring resilience, they bring all kinds of perks to stay injured and be absolutely fine. And on top of that, even if you try to go for the 5th hit, survivors will body block for each other. How this works is very simple. If a survivor has mending and you're going for another survivor, they can actually get in your way by using a bit of teamwork. And if you hit the mending survivor a second time, that cancels your power. So what me and my friends did, and what high-level survivors will do to you when you play against them, is do this to deny you ever from getting your 5th hit down, if they're competent at it. Of course, against lesser coordinated teams, you can still do it from time to time. But outside of that, Legion does have a few tools that are honestly pretty awesome. You can bring Coup de Grace to make your M1s a little bit more effective, make your basic attacks a bit more unpredictable. You can bring Play with Your Food, which is one of my personal favorites. Chase the Obsession a bunch, find the Obsession initially with your power, and obviously farm stacks until you're really fast and everyone else goes down. But ultimately, I think the inability to have any insane add-on that has this crazy effect, or the fact that you have nothing once people really split up or are comfortable being injured, I think just relegates Legion to a fairly mediocre spot on the tier list. By no means he is weak or useless or anything. And if you feel like you're doing really well with Legion and he should be a little bit higher, I would not disagree with you. I would just tell you that maybe the other killers that you could play instead are arguably even stronger than that. Now, I haven't really used an extreme tag or an extreme description of a killer ever since the Spirit or Chucky or so. But now we go to the other extreme. We go to the killers that I honestly believe are on the underpower side of the game, starting with Myers. Now, Myers has a saving grace, which honestly I don't even appreciate, which is his add-ons. Myers has one, maybe arguably two add-ons that are a little bit overtuned, and with those add-ons, he becomes a really mean killer that is ravenously good at punishing survivor mistakes and survivor lack of coordination. I'm talking mostly about the purple add-on, the Tombstone piece. With the Tombstone piece, Michael stalks survivors for a little while, and if you catch someone in the open and they're not super aware and they don't go into a locker, you instantly murder them. And survivors can delay this. They can do things to somewhat prevent it, but it's very likely that the average team is not going to be able to sometimes stop it in time. He also has the very mean ability to instantly murder someone while they're unhooking themselves. If you have a survivor on the hook and they have the anti-camp and they use it against you, well, you can just murder them during the animation with the Tombstone. That is extremely mean. A different alternative would be Infinite Tier 3 Tombstone, or Infinite Tier 3 in general. If you manage to find one survivor that is a little bit lost and you get a lot of stock out of them, and you get Tier 3 early in some maps, that can be tough. That can be pretty tough. Mind you, against the higher level teams, it's not that insane, but again, especially with this and Tombstone, Myers, as you can see, his potential can spike up a little bit. There are also some other gimmicky situations where Myers is arguably fairly strong, but I think they're very risky, and I wouldn't depend on them very much. For example, if you use the scratch mirror, you can make your terror radius permanently 0 and then send yourself to a small map, like or get lucky and be sent to a small map like Larry's, where survivors will constantly be unable to tell where you're coming from, and you'll have basically wall hacks on them. However, consider, what if they send you to another map? What if you don't have a map offering? Then I think all this gameplay becomes really gimmicky. But for the most part, if we avoid these gimmicky and outlier add-ons that are a little bit overtuned, if we ignore that, the rest of Myers is honestly really pathetic. He's a killer that has a few minute advantages. He has a smaller terror radius than usual, which is awesome during his normal mode, and a slightly faster vault animation, which, I mean, it doesn't hurt. But other than that, he starts out weaker than normal. He starts out in tier 1 and needs to stalk survivors for 5 seconds, more or less, before he gets to tier 2. That is terrible. That is absolutely terrible. killers in Dead by Daylight start the game by losing. A killer at 5 gens is normally starting in a losing position. Even really strong killers with really strong chases lose 1, 2, maybe 3 generators at the start, and that is almost expected, right? The nice thing about that is that you normally have perks to make the end game stronger, or make the middle game stronger, or maybe delay those first gens with corrupt intervention, and then it's manageable, right? But a killer that starts out not just weaker like every other killer, but also behind on their power is just terrible. And Myers is exactly that. With Myers, you need to sneak up to a survivor and use the first potentially 10, 15 seconds of your game just to be a normal killer. Just to be the normal speed killer. If you don't do that, you move basically slower than survivors and you're wasting your time. Yes, every now and then you play against a clueless or distracted survivor and you get a grab out of a gen, and that's really funny. We've all done it. But let's be honest, especially against teams that are smart or that send you to a big map or both, you're never going to get that. And even risking that is really, it could be counterproductive. If you go for a grab and the game disagrees with you and you fail the grab and now you get a hit, well, maybe that survivor runs you to somewhere that you cannot chase them in, and now you're still in tier 1. So the early game of Myers is absolutely brutal. And even if you are in a situation where you're like, oh, I got to start pretty quickly, guys. Look, it only took me 20 seconds to get to tier 2. That's bad. That's bad. If you were playing Ghostface at that point, you would have one person already down or one person down later. With other killers, if you have a good early game, you even begin to alter the course of the game and you start winning. For example, if you get a first hit on Oni early on, that doesn't win you the game right away, but it can potentially turn things around really quickly. Before they do a gen or two, you are already a demon. And with Myers, you almost will never have a game at the start that goes like this. With the occasional map that's indoors, yeah, okay, your terror radius and maybe gimmicky stealth can kind of come into play. But for the most part, your early game is terrible, and that already sets the tone for the rest of the game. Outside of the add-ons that I mentioned, Myers basically just runs add-ons to increase his talking speed. He has so many add-ons that are redundant and useless and stupid and conditional and susceptible to auto read blocking from perks like distortion. So he's very, very predictable outside of those. And in my opinion, one of the saddest killers in the game, where even popping tier 3 against good survivors doesn't really mean that much because you'll be getting a down at best if they play it well. I didn't mention a few other add-ons that are honestly okay. There's the bow tie, which gives you a 90-second, forgive me, a 90-second tier 2, which tier 3, which is really good, but it comes at the cost of making your early game even worse, which can sometimes be a big deal. Overall, he's just really, really held back by the early game. And honestly, even though I've covered most of what I think there is to say about him, I think that's ultimately what holds him back. With Trapper, we have a similar issue. As I mentioned earlier, during the Myers segment, most killers start the game by losing. At the start, survivors have every resource. The first chase could easily be the longest one ever while they drop all their pallets, and they're spreading out. They have nothing else to do but generators, so you need to put pressure then quick. And Trapper has the very unfortunate power that needs a lot of setup. And unlike Hag, this setup doesn't always pay off. With Hag, for the most part, you set up a little bit, it can hugely cut the chases in less than half later on. With Skull Merchant, you set a few drones, you barely waste any time, and you become undetectable. With Trapper, you set up the wrong way, you lose the game. It's that simple. Even if you have certain add-ons to start with all your traps, even if you benefit from the recent buff, I'll talk about his buffs in a minute, that make the traps spawn more close towards the gens and the middle. Those are good things, but he's still a killer that takes a lot of time to set up. And all of this setup can fail for a multitude of reasons. If survivors have a map, which thank God is not very common, they can see your traps. They can highlight your traps to their teammates even with a map. So if if by some miracle they know that they're going against a trapper, or they just get a map for whatever reason, I would honestly probably, if I was a new trapper player, I would probably dodge lobbies with maps, because you don't know if they're going to be able to see it depending on the add-ons the map has, or if it's a pink add-on, or if it's a pink map, then they can see it. Like, it's ridiculous that this killer is outplayed by one item. Luckily, this is a very rare thing. A more common occurrence is that survivors will just see you. If you spend too much time setting away far away, you're giving up too many gens. If you go to the middle where the action happens and you set up there, survivors might spot you. And from that point on, you might have one guy following you, calling out every trap or disarming them from time to time. And it is a little bit infuriating. Even you also, as a killer, have no indication of who is playing solo. So anytime you put a survivor on a hook and you trap next to them, that could be one person that knows about the trap or 4 people that know about the trap. And you don't know unless you have some kind of guess as to whether or not that person's in the team. So, yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Now, that being said, the trapper did receive some buffs recently, which are honestly amazing. They are great. I'm not complaining at all. Even though he's still one of the weaker killers, those buffs were good. So I'm really not trying to take away from them. The buffs make him set up traps and get a bit of a speed boost afterwards, which is super, super helpful, because you can use them a bit more aggressively in the loop, and it buys you a little bit of time. And the trap spawn logic being improved is also a huge deal. So those are nice. And even if we were in a world where survivors played perfectly, you can still use the new trapper buffs to honestly be a bit of a menace and set up traps during chase, force them into areas that maybe are not so safe. And even that alone is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. Now, the real deal, the real way you play trapper, there's basically two ways to play trapper, and this is the way you're going to win most of your games. Number one, survivors are stupid. Even at high rank, survivors are still a little bit too stupid. They will often run into grass, even though they're not being chased. They will hug tight loops, even though you're not there, and they will step on traps that they don't have to. I cannot count the amount of games as a survivor and as a killer that I've seen survivors needlessly run into a trap. Little piece of advice: if you're playing survivor against a trapper, just don't step on grass, or look at the grass that you stepped in, or don't hug the things. Just go a little bit wider. It takes 0.2 seconds more to do that, and it avoids every possible trap. But yeah, survivors, even at high levels, still make plenty of mistakes. And even though it's a little bit of RNG, sometimes, this killer is incredibly good at punishing mistakes. In some scenario, a survivor will step on a trap, and you'll be not even that far, but they'll get rescued immediately. Or they'll get off the trap randomly, because there's a 1 in 6 that they'll get out. Sometimes they get out immediately. Sometimes it takes them 6 attempts, but it can be anything in between. So sometimes a survivor stepping on a trap will mean nothing. A survivor that steps on a trap, by the way, can still be partially healed afterwards. So say a survivor has a 99 heal because he had a medkit, he can step on a trap and then finish the heal afterwards, or come out of a trap with adrenaline. So the traps are really not super scary. Unless you have a few add-ons that give extra effects. And even then, you don't have enough add-on slots to make them scary. So traps are not really that big of a deal. But sometimes they will step on a trap in the worst possible location at the worst possible time. And that can easily turn the game around and win you a game. There is almost no situation in which a trapper should give up, because sometimes just having one trap in the map, that can be the trap that destroys the team. 2 people go down, 3rd person steps on a trap, game over. Now you go for the 4th guy, game over. So that ability is honestly awesome, but it very much relies on survivors being a little bit stupid. The other second thing that Trapper has going for him that I personally find super boring, but it's still there, is basement. Most of the maps have a basement somewhere, and most of them are easily defended. About half the basements are in shack, more or less, give or take. And around shack, you can do the very simple thing of you hook in basement, you trap the top, and survivors are screwed. If you camp it smartly, the anti-camp doesn't work well enough because you're not too close to the bottom of the basement. Getting in there is impossible. Even if they get in there, you can reset the traps really quickly, and getting out is impossible. So basically, basement trapper is a death trap, and is easily one of the most consistent ways that you can get victories. If a survivor goes down next to basement, they're basically screwed. Now, however, the problem, what if survivors follow the rules of don't step into stupid traps randomly by looking at your feet and stay away from basement, which, for most maps, it's pretty doable. If they do these two things, you are literally the worst killer in the game. You are useless. You are so bad. You have a power that needs setup, that runs out. Consider Skull Merchant. If you go to a loop with Skull Merchant, you place a drone, they have to leave. With Trapper, you do that, but now you're out of a trap. Maybe you need to go and pick up another, and you need setup, and you don't have stealth, and you don't have sweep boot, and you don't give them deep wound base kit, and you don't slow them down base kit, and you don't do all of those other things that other killers do. So, yeah. Not to mention, some of his best perks are getting nerfed in the next patch. Say There's Flash is taking a nerf, the ability to grab someone out of a trap. It was bugged in the PTP, it didn't work as it should, but presumably that will be bad as well. So I don't see Trapper climbing out of this low spot in the tier list, sadly. If you think that you are incredible at Trapper, I commend you. You must be really amazing, but I guarantee you that if you put that same passion and skill on other killers, you would almost always get better results. Ultimately, the fact that he has to set up and the fact that he's countered by teamwork, coordination, callouts, and even maps is the thing that holds him back the most, I'm afraid. But yet, he is not the number one killer at the bottom. The worst killer in the game, arguably right now, is Freddy. Now, this was honestly very, very difficult. Picking the worst killer in the game was unbelievably difficult. Honestly, I had half a mind on making Trapper the worst killer in the game, because as you can see, compared to Trapper, Freddy has a higher ceiling. At his best, Trapper is worse than Freddy at his best, which is interesting. However, what led me to ultimately decide that Freddy might possibly be the weakest killer in the game? It's just the nuclear options. If you want to play mean Trapper, he does have a few add-ons that are fairly strong and work well on half the maps. If you want to play a mean Myers, which is also a lower tier killer that we just talked about, he does have, as we mentioned, some add-ons that are fairly mean and can allow you to have a really good chance to beat down a team. But now let's think about Freddy. Think about the meanest Freddy build. It's nothing. This is one of the most harmless, inoffensive killers left in the game. He has such a porous, full of holes base kit that works sometimes, that doesn't work sometimes, and has a lot of counterplay. And one of the worst catalog of add-ons out of the entire game. His meanest add-on simply makes his power work a bit more often, and that's it. That's his best add-on. And everything past that is honestly situational and sometimes not even good at all. So yeah, ultimately, I think Freddy is possibly the worst killer, not because he's the worst in terms of add-on-less play, but because almost every other killer has a chance to get a bit of a lottery. Let's review some of the other killers we talked about earlier. Legion, if you play against people that are a bit clueless and you have a small map, you're good. Clown, if you play against one of the people that honestly get sick when they get the motion sickness from the things, well, you're going to probably deal with them really quickly. Pig, Ghostface, all of these killers have a situation or two where luck can be on their way and they can be really scary. Maybe they have a map where they really shine. Freddy has no strengths. He doesn't have as many weaknesses as some of the other killers, you could argue, but he has no strengths almost to speak of. He has almost nothing unique to him. And they also recently nerfed him slightly in a way that's really not too interesting. Now, let's talk about the base kit of Freddy. So Freddy is, for the most part, a normal killer, a bit shorter than some of the other ones, and not particularly loud, so he can do some mind games behind some obstacles. And also, when survivors passively go into the dream world, he has no terror radius. So he can be a bit deceptive in how he approaches. Nothing super crazy, but he has a bit of that. And against average and below average survivors, lesser experienced survivors, this is okay. This already is pretty good. He has two powers. The main power that never changes, that is honestly one of his best assets, is the teleport. Freddy, every now and then, has the ability to choose a generator and teleport to that generator. It takes a while. It's not super fast. It doesn't oh my god, catch a survivor in the act. It's pretty well telegraphed. There's even a sound that lets survivors know. Every now and then, I will teleport to a gen and run into a survivor afterwards. But if they pay attention to the sound, that should almost never happen. Right? So nothing insane. But believe it or not, especially on the bigger maps, this is very helpful. Whenever you down a survivor with most other killers, especially with, say, Myers or Trapper or Clown, you need to think to yourself, okay, how far am I from the action? Oof, this is bad. Sometimes a survivor taking you to a corner of the map is just an amazing play on their part, because it will take you so long to hook them and then so long to go back to the action. But with Freddy, doesn't matter when you down someone, you can teleport right away, far away into whichever gen is the most progress. And luckily for you, there's a lot of perks that allow you to probably figure out where that is and show up there, maybe kick a gen with some perks. Now, those perks are not as strong as they used to be. And the initial down could take a long time because Freddy doesn't have a lot of help in chase if a survivor is awake. If a survivor is awake, I think it's fair to say that Freddy has essentially no power over them. When survivors fall asleep, then things change because you get to use the second power, which is either the snare or the pallets, the fake pallets. I'm going to tell you right now, the fake pallets are awful. The fake pallets, they take up a slot and they are terrible. If you chase a survivor into an area and they drop a fake pallet, well, guess what? That pallet's not there. So if you chase them into that area, normally, yeah, you would have gotten it down anyway. It's true that some survivors use the perk windows of opportunity and they just follow the yellow color and they can fall for that. But for the most part, most maps have so many fixed pallets that survivors can put two and two together. And don't forget, when they're awake, or if a teammate of theirs is awake, they can just call out which pallets are real or not. So it's not very good. Pallets are not very good. They're fun though. Keep using them if you want to. Now, snares are better. You used to be able to place snares through walls, which was pretty awesome. They removed that feature. That sucks. And he's also been nerfed as of some months ago. I think that was out in the previous tier list, but he has now the ability to carry less pallets and snares, and he slows himself down if he holds them. Not a big deal, but they nerfed a bit. You cannot spam snares everywhere, but you can use them in chase as a bit of a clown slowdown system. It's fairly reliable, and I think it's fairly good. But again, it's only when they are asleep. Survivors can wake up via skill checks with their teammates or by using the clocks. And one amazing thing that happens is that if they use their clocks and you hit them, they do not fall asleep for the first 30 seconds. That's huge. And if they come out of the hook, Freddy used to be incredibly good at punishing people off the hook. He used to ignore a lot of things that other killers had to deal with, and he was very good at tunneling aggressively. Now he can't do that. If you hit a survivor off the hook, even if they take the damage and they go deep wound, they don't fall asleep. So you cannot use your power to maybe tunnel someone, which you might be like, oh, you shouldn't be tunneling. Yeah, but there's times when you might want to, or there's times when a person off the hook comes to take a hit for someone else that's in an even worse position, and you cannot get them to be asleep. So that survivor is immune to your powers. So yeah, if you're getting down relatively regularly and cycling through gens, this killer holds up and his potential is fairly average. If you are going against teams that are strong and smart and waking up and not giving you a chance to get it down, your mobility and your teleport means very little because you have no pressure. You teleport to a gen, they work on others. You don't have any perk that activates on hook. You don't have anything to make survivors have to let go of gens, like go to a hook. So for that, and for the absolute horrendous, and I mean absolutely horrendous amount of terrible add-ons that he has, where even his best add-ons are just not that scary, I sentence him to be possibly the worst killer. Although you could make the argument that he's better than the other killers just because he can deal with big maps better. However, as we mentioned earlier, keep in mind that there's less and less big maps than before. Some of the bigger maps in the game are being shrunk, and the old cowshed, the old mother's dwelling, these maps that other low tier killers were terribly afraid of and Freddy was more or less okay with, they're now not as big of a deal. So I think that's ultimately one of the other factors that maybe has made Freddy sink into the bottom. You might disagree with it. Sometimes, chat and dear viewers, I don't always agree with myself because this is an incredibly difficult game to evaluate based on a myriad of factors. But if you've read my criteria and you have something to add or some dissenting opinion that you think could add to the conversation, please feel free to leave it in the comments. I will read as many of them as I can. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you the next time that we do one of these tier lists in probably a few months. Bye bye. See ya.